This is Starting Over in Silverleaf Falls by Christina Butrum. Audio, copyright 2022.
Chapter 1. Wes Davis pulled into the driveway belonging to Silverleaf Stables and shifted his old truck into park. He'd spent the morning preparing for the conversation he would have with his longtime friend, Dax Sudduth. It had been years since he'd last seen Dax, but the news of his friend's ownership of the stables came as no surprise when Wes ran into Dax's grandfather, Joe, at the hardware store last week. A simple run into town had led Wes straight to a tip on a job he couldn't avoid. The old man informed Wes that his grandson was looking for someone to hire at the stables, and it just so happened, Joe thought Wes was exactly who Dax needed to hire. Wes pulled the keys from the ignition and tucked them into his pocket as he climbed out of his truck. He wasn't sure what to expect Dax to say, but he could only hope that their conversation would end with thanking Dax for a job. Wes was making his way to the front entrance of the administration building and someone working beside a horse in the pasture hollered out to him, "Wes Davis." Dax dropped what he was doing and made his way over to the fence line. "Is that you, man?" Wes shifted his direction and walked toward the pasture. Gravel crunched underneath his boots as he made his way over to his longtime friend, realizing not much had changed in the last several years. He was still sporting the same rugged cowboy look he'd donned through high school, and there was no doubt in Wes's mind that Dax was still managing the title of a rodeo star he'd claimed right out of school after graduation. "Yep, it's me," Wes said, offering Dax a firm handshake when he approached the fence. "I heard that you're looking for some help around here." "Something like that." He paused, but without missing a beat, he asked, "Why? Do you know anyone interested?" The light chuckle that escaped Dax only proved that he didn't suspect Wes was there looking for a job. Wes was quick to prove him wrong in his assumption. "Right now, I'll take whatever I can get." "Whatever you can get?" Dax unlatched the gate and stepped in front of Wes. He studied him, a look of confusion creasing his brow, almost as though he wasn't sure how to take Wes. "What happened to life in the city? I thought you settled down and got married. You also had a kid or two, right?" "Yeah, but I'm here now and need to get some things sorted out." Wes refused to go into detail about what had caused him to leave the city. None of that mattered right now. The divorce from his wife weighed heavily on his mind, and raising his little girl the best he could on his own was his top priority. He couldn't give her the life she needed if they continued living at the Starlight Motel. "Kenzie's having cake and ice cream in town with a friend, so I figured I'd have time to stop by and see if you could use my help or not. We have a lot of catching up to do, but I suppose that can wait for another day." Dax pulled off his work gloves and rested them on a nearby fence post before motioning for Wes to follow him. "But for the record, I'd just like to say that I can't believe you're back in Silverleaf Falls." Wes followed Dax into the administration building, noticing a slight limp in the way his friend walked. There was no doubt Dax sustained injuries while chasing the thrill of an 8-second ride through the years. On a scale of 1 to 10, how good are you at waking up before the sun rises in the morning? Wes couldn't remember the last time he'd slept in. "I can be here whatever time you need me to be," Wes assured. "Chores around here start bright and early, right before the crack of dawn," Dax said, holding the door for Wes as he led them a short distance down a hallway and into an office on the left. Dax offered Wes a place to sit down across from him. Scattered papers, invoices, and what appeared to be other bookkeeping notes and friendly reminders written on post-its buried the wooden desk. "I like to have the stalls cleaned out daily and fresh water offered 2 to 3 times a day. Is that something you could do?" Wes gave a quick nod. Of course. He was ready and willing to do whatever Dax needed to be done, just as long as he was giving a job. As long as he landed a job, Wes could focus on giving Kenzie everything she wanted, like a backyard with a swing set and a pool. "I hate to start you out with mucking the stalls, but I can't keep up around here as it is," Dax stated with a subtle shrug. "I'd like to get a few younger guys in there, but it's been a challenge to find good workers." "I bet. I suppose there aren't too many young kids who like getting their hands dirty nowadays," Wes said, thinking back to his days in school. Out of everyone he knew in their graduating class, there had only been a handful who enjoyed hard physical work. Most ended up working in law offices, like Cooper Jackson, or starting their own businesses in neat and clean office spaces. You can say that again, Dax said with a quick laugh. Whatever happened to the tough love from the older folks? I think I was 8 or 9 when my father first introduced me to working in the fields. No doubt there's something missing when it comes to parenting nowadays. His own father had taught him a thing or two about cars and farm equipment when he first started up his own mechanic shop in the heart of the small town. I'm guessing they're nothing like our parents were back in the day. Wes leaned back in the chair. He studied the framed certificates lining the wall and asked, "Are you still taking part in the rodeo circuits?" "Not anymore," Dax said with a hint of disappointment in his voice. "I returned home 2 years ago after a bull riding incident put an end to my career." After a long pause, Dax added, "It's hard to think about what might have been or where I'd be if I hadn't gotten injured. It's crazy how fast things can change in a blink of an eye, isn't it?" At a loss for words, Wes nodded. Dax had experience in the rodeo circuits since they'd been kids in high school. Wes had ventured off on his own path, finding his way to the city before settling down and getting married. He'd be the first to admit that he'd taken time for granted while assuming he had forever to enjoy the family life. "Speaking of which," Dax said, leaning forward in his chair and resting his arms on a stack of papers in front of him. "I never expected to see you back in town. How long are you planning to stick around?" "I'm here to stay," Wes said. "I just got Kenzie enrolled at Silver Leaf Falls Elementary and have been looking for a place to rent while staying at the Starlight Motel." Starlight Motel, just north of town. The motel was on Highway 7 and had seemed like a perfect spot to camp out until something came along. He'd worked out a deal with the owners, Bill and Jane Evers, offering to repair a few leaks and do a few landscaping projects in return for free room and board. They were an older couple who enjoyed having their company, so Wes didn't worry about overstaying his welcome. "It's a nice little place, but I'm looking for a place of our own so Kenzie can have a yard to play in with things most kids her age like to brag about. Something she'd had before we moved back to Silver Leaf Falls." "How old is she now?" Dax's question pulled Wes from his thoughts and back to the present conversation about his daughter. "Does she like horses?" "She just turned 6 in June," Wes replied, reflecting on the birthday party he'd promised her once they got settled in at the motel but still hadn't provided 2 months later. "And I'm sure she's fond of all animals, including horses, even though she's never been up close and personal with one." Dax looked down at a paper in front of him and studied it before saying, "What if I offered you a place here on the ranch?" "A job?" Wes asked, meeting Dax's gaze from across the desk as his friend shook his head. Wes wasn't sure what Dax was referring to if he hadn't meant working on the ranch. "I'm not sure what you mean." Dax leaned back in his chair and folded his hands behind his head as he said, "I mean moving into the cabin here at the ranch. It's the only one I've got, but I'll let you and Kenzie move into it." Wes liked the idea of having a place of his own with his daughter. The thought of not having to drive too far to work seemed appealing as well. "How much?" Dax shook his head and cracked a smile. "Much like the Everses, I won't charge you room and board as long as you continue to work on the ranch. I could use a dedicated worker, and I'd like to think that several people around here would enjoy having Kenzie around as well. Maybe then my mother will leave me alone about falling in love and having kids someday soon." Wes shared a laugh with Dax about his mother's expectations. He knew all too well how their mothers expected grandchildren the moment there had been a hint of crushing on women. "Sounds like a deal to me," Wes stated, reaching across the desk and shaking Dax's hand. "I'd be a fool to turn an offer like that down." Dax nodded with a smile. "Well then, welcome to Silver Leaf Stables. How soon can you start?" Wes thought about the few things he had promised to finish at the motel, not to mention getting Kenzie prepared for back-to-school night on the village green in a couple of days. "Can you give me until the start of next week?" Wes asked, keeping everything sorted out in his mind. "I'd like to finish up a few things for the Everses and get Kenzie ready for school to start before I introduce another big change into our lives." Dax patted Wes on the back as he walked him out of the office and down the hallway toward the building's exit. "Sounds good. I look forward to seeing you around. We'll have plenty of time to catch up then." "Thanks, man," Wes said, reaching into his front pocket and pulling out his truck keys. "I'll keep in touch between now and then. Let me know if there's anything else you need from me." Dax followed him to his truck and leaned on the door as Wes climbed into the driver's seat. Wes slid the keys into the ignition and fired up the old truck as Dax welcomed him back to Silver Leaf Falls and promised Wes and his little girl a solid future at Silver Leaf Stables.
Chapter 2. Brenna Gibson stuffed the supplies she needed into her oversized canvas tote and tossed the strap over her shoulder before climbing out of her car. Cakes by Chloe was Brenna's go-to place every morning, and she looked forward to eating the cupcake of the week while drinking coffee and catching up with Chloe. Brenna tossed her keys into the side pocket of her tote and headed for the front entrance of her best friend's business. The mid-morning sun peeked through the standing trees surrounding the green. Just enough sun to warm the crisp end-of-summer air in the heart of Vermont. No sooner had Brenna opened the door and stepped inside than the bell above rang out and Chloe greeted her with a perky good morning. Chloe busied herself behind the counter as Brenna met her near the display case full of morning delight that promised a good day. "Give me just 1 minute and I'll be right there," Chloe called out as she scrambled from one end of the counter to the other. "Take your time," Brenna said with a wave of her hand. She was in no hurry, and from the looks of it, she had a tough decision to make. She had her mind set on trying the newest flavor of the week, but there were too many cupcakes that caught her attention as she peered into the display case. "Brenna?" Brenna straightened as someone from behind her called out her name. She adjusted the oversized tote on her shoulder as she turned to face Steph. Brenna had heard through the rumor mill that Steph Kennedy had recently moved in with her sister, Katie, but she hadn't believed it. "How long are you in town?" Steph looked over her shoulder toward two little girls, around the same age, eating cake and ice cream in a nearby booth. She turned her attention back to Brenna and said, "We moved in with Katie not too long ago. It was supposed to be temporary, but we're here to stay for a lot longer than we originally planned." "It's so good to see you," Brenna said, wrapping her old friend in another hug. She hadn't wanted to believe the rumors. Steph had made a wonderful life for herself. If the rumors were true, that only meant one thing. "The girls are enjoying cake and ice cream for Ally's birthday," Steph said, pointing toward the girls sitting in the booth. Both had chocolate-covered faces and smiles from ear to ear. They were having a good time, and Brenna was happy to see them enjoying the last few days of summer before school started. It was somewhat last minute, but thankfully Chloe could whip something up real quick. They turned their attention to Chloe, who was now taking an order over the phone for what sounded like an upcoming event. "She's good at what she does," Steph said. "It's good to see that she's followed her dreams of opening her own business." Brenna couldn't agree more. The neutral-colored walls, with pastel purple seating matched Chloe's personality to a T. Starting a bakery had always been Chloe's primary focus. Brenna recalled their conversation when they had graduated from high school and shared their plans for the future. "And you're a teacher, right?" Steph asked, pulling Brenna's attention back to the moment. "Grandma Gertie mentioned something about you teaching at the elementary school." "Yes, I've been teaching first grade for a few years now," Brenna said with a smile. "Grandma Gertie volunteers in my classroom every year. The kids adore her." "Ally can't stop talking about her," Steph said with a smile. "Ever since the day they met. Much like with Kenzie." Brenna followed her friend's gaze to the two kids in the booth. They finished eating and focused on coloring pages full of cupcakes. "How old are they now?" "They're 6, Steph said, her attention still on the girls as they colored each cupcake in many colors. "Knowing the girls would more than likely start first grade this year," she said, "I'm pretty sure they'll be in my class this year. Do you mind if I say hello?" "Not at all," Steph said, motioning for Brenna to follow her over to the table. A part of her envied the thought of what it was like having children, but she couldn't be happier for Steph. She loved kids just as much, if not more, than Brenna. "Hi there," Brenna said, approaching the table with a wide smile on her face as she waved at the two girls with chocolate-covered faces. "Are you excited for school to start?" The girls shouted an excited yes as they finished their sweet treats. Brenna smiled as she introduced herself. So, I'll be seeing you soon then, won't I? The girls offered big nods. Seeing them excited to start school and to have her as their teacher made Brenna's heart happy. I suppose I should round them up and get a move on, Steph said, after glancing at her watch. She turned to Brenna, offering her one last hug. It was so good to see you. You as well, Brenna said, cherishing the moment she had to catch up with her longtime friend. We should grab lunch sometime. Sizzle and Sip is my go-to for comfort food, and I just love Scott and Lori night. I've heard nothing but the best about that restaurant, Steph said as she made her way over to the children. She pulled a package of wipes from her purse and began wiping away any sign of chocolate overload. We'll definitely have to meet there. I'll try to find a sitter so we can catch up without tiny distractions. Steph made a funny face as she booped the girls on the nose. It didn't take long before she was herding them past Brenna and toward the exit. Brenna offered a friendly wave to each of the girls, regardless of the fact neither of them paid any attention as they carried on their own conversation about horses and cupcakes. Brenna released a happy sigh as she turned back toward the counter. Chloe arranged the display case, sorting the cupcakes by flavor, and added new ones to the shelves as Brenna approached her. It was good to see her again, Brenna said, setting her tote down on the floor next to her feet. She'd carried it long enough for her shoulder to cry out. The tote was heavy enough with just the necessities, but throwing in crafting supplies made it even more so. I see that you're keeping busy around here. Chloe pulled her head out of the display case long enough to acknowledge Brenna's assumption with a smile. A day's job is never done, but I'm not complaining. Brenna shared a quick laugh with Chloe as she watched her organize the last 3 glass shelves. Brenna used the time she had to choose which cupcake she would enjoy with a cup of coffee. She could only hope that Chloe wasn't too busy to join in on a quick morning chat over coffee. Phew, Chloe said as she brushed her hands against the front of her purple apron. It takes a lot of work to get things just right in there. It looks nice, Brenna complimented. I'm sure everyone in town looks forward to coming here for the wide choice of baked goods. I know I do. Chloe accepted Brenna's compliment with a shy smile. Brenna knew her friend like the back of her hand, and though Chloe was confident and could pull anything off, she also had a hard time accepting compliments, regardless of who said them. Coffee with 2 creamers coming up, Chloe announced as she poured the steaming hot liquid from the carafe and set it back down. She slid the cup across the counter and handed Brenna 2 creamer pods to enjoy with her coffee. Which cupcake would you like to try today? Brenna had spent her time watching her friend organize the goodies, and though she had tried her best to choose a cupcake, she failed tremendously. Surprise me. Chloe tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and made her way to the opposite end of the counter. She reached in and pulled out a muffin and handed it over to Brenna. It's not a cupcake, but it will go well with your coffee. Brenna thanked her as she accepted what appeared to be some kind of coffee cake muffin with vanilla glaze swirled on top. It's one of my favorites, Chloe said as she grabbed one for herself before pouring herself a cup of coffee. Cappuccino chocolate chip. Brenna balanced her coffee and muffin in one hand while picking up the tote off the floor with the other. She tried her best not to spill her coffee as she hobbled her way to a nearby table. It looks good. I can't wait to try it, Brenna noted, carefully setting her food and drink down on the table before dropping her tote in the chair next to her as Chloe reached a hand out to help her get situated. What do you have in here? Chloe asked with a laugh. It feels like a ton of bricks. Brenna slid into her chair and offered a slight shrug. Just a few supplies I need to finish up my project. A few, or the whole crafting room? Chloe teased. I think you might have forgotten the kitchen sink while you were at it. Brenna dismissed Chloe's joke with a playful wave of her hand. I didn't want to forget anything, and besides, I wanted to spend the time out of the house today. It's a win-win. Are you ready for your new class of students? I will be once I get everything put together, Brenna said, glancing over at the tote sitting next to her. She had spent the morning packing everything she needed to get a good start on the flyers and other handouts for the kids and their parents. I should have everything ready to go before back-to-school night. Chloe bit into her muffin and washed it down with a drink of coffee before saying, "That event is always so much fun. I know a lot of kids are looking forward to that night." Brenna took a bite of her muffin, holding off on the conversation while enjoying her special treat. She knew better than to make eating sweets a habit, but they were hard to resist while catching up with Chloe. "This is fantastic," Brenna said with a mouthful of coffee-flavored goodness. She wiped her hands with a napkin before sliding her cup of coffee off to the side and digging into her supplies. She pulled out the flyers she had created and printed off the computer the night before and set them on the table in front of her. She'd spent a lot of time getting them just right while hoping her kids would enjoy getting to know her a little better before the first day of school. "I'm somewhat jealous that you weren't my first grade teacher," Chloe said as she finished off the last of her muffin. "I don't think Mrs. Abbott took being a teacher as seriously as you." "Ah, but she was still a wonderful teacher," Brenna said, thinking back to their first grade teacher. "I'd like to think that she enjoyed teaching as much as I do." "Just not as fun as you," Chloe interrupted with a light-hearted chuckle. "Everyone can tell how much you love teaching, Bren. It's obvious in the time you spend preparing for the school year." Chloe pointed to the stack of papers surrounded by scrapbooking scissors and said, "I mean, look at this. You are doing a really great job with making the kids feel welcome and excited for school to start." Brenna's cheeks warmed with the compliment. She wouldn't want it any other way. She loved her students as if they were her own children and wanted what was best for them. Brenna enjoyed putting things together for the students and their parents, hoping that it made their first day of school less intimidating and a lot more fun. "I just love kids," Brenna admitted as she pulled out another stack of papers and set them in front of her. "Besides, I wouldn't know what to do with myself if I didn't create back-to-school folders for the kiddos and their parents." Chloe smiled with a gleam in her eye. It was obvious to Brenna that her friend might think she was going a bit overboard, but she didn't care. She wanted her students to have the best first grade year they could while leaving them with something to remember her. "Oh shoot." Chloe scrambled out of her chair and to her feet. She held up her hand and said, "Hold that thought. I forgot all about the marble cake in the oven." Brenna checked the time on her phone before busying herself with organizing packets for back-to-school night. The PTA board members hosted the annual event on the green. Brenna expected more than 100 parents and their children to attend while enjoying the activities planned for the evening. She gathered the supplies she needed to create flipbooks that included several tabs marked with individual information. She found the idea on Pinterest and had spent the last 2 days printing the information on cardstock. She included a friendly welcome on the first card, along with her contact information, before adding the extras. The calendar, class schedule, classroom rules, and birthdays preceded the cards marked for reading, dress code, and homework. At first, Brenna found the information to be overwhelming for 6-year-olds, but she made it colorful and fun to counter the information overload. Once she completed the flipbooks, she could focus on creating props for the back-to-school night photo booth. Chloe approached the table as Brenna put the last of the flipbooks together. Brenna looked up with a smile as Chloe picked one up from the table and flipped through it. "These are adorable, Bren," Chloe said as she slid back into her chair across from Brenna. "You're so creative and fun." Brenna gathered a finished stack and carefully tucked them into individual folders, including the flyer she created that told her students all about her. "I vaguely remember Mrs. Abbott slipping a paper like this in our folders on the first day of school," Chloe said, lifting an All About Me paper from a nearby pile. "These papers were so fun to complete with our parents." Brenna smiled as she continued putting together folders with each of her students' names on the front. She stopped when she arrived at Ally's and Kenzie's folders. "I could have given these folders to Ally and Kenzie while they were here. It would have given them a head start on getting to know me and what to expect in first grade." Chloe offered a light-hearted smile as she assured Brenna that they had plenty of time to prepare for first grade. "Besides, it's not like the event isn't right around the corner. They'll have them in no time at all." Brenna relaxed as she finished the last of her muffin and coffee. She planned to meet with the PTA board members, along with Noah Knight, at Sizzle and Sip later that week. Once there, they would go over the final details to prepare for another exciting school year.
Chapter 3. Wes guided his truck into town, finding a vacant spot next to the green. People and children of all ages filled the center of Main Street as they gathered around the event. Kenzie's excitement to meet her teacher rubbed off on him as he shifted the truck into park. His little girl would start her first day of first grade in less than a week, and he wasn't sure where the years had gone. From diapers to pigtails and wearing a summer dress, Wes cherished every memory they'd made along the way. There was no doubt in his mind that tonight would be one of those memories. "There's Ally, Dad," Kenzie pointed out before racing off to meet up with her new best friend. Wes watched as his daughter wrapped her arms around Ally and both girls squealed with excitement to have found one another. Steph offered a friendly wave as Wes approached them. He'd heard all about Steph's situation from Jane Evers the day Steph dropped Kenzie off at the motel. From what Jane had mentioned, Steph was living with her sister and going through a rough patch in her marriage. Wes had clarified that he was not interested in Steph or anyone. He'd decided to move back to the small town for the closeness of the community. A lot had changed in the last several years, with the loss of his parents and then divorcing his wife. He wasn't interested in finding love in the small town. His primary focus was starting over and providing the best life he could for Kenzie. "Dad, look over there," Kenzie announced as she pointed to a booth marked with a banner that welcomed first graders. "Let's go." Kenzie took hold of his hand and nearly dragged him to the booth as Steph and Ally followed close behind. "I saw her while eating ice cream," Kenzie pointed out the blonde woman standing directly behind the open booth filled with colorful folders and photo booth props. "Ally," Kenzie called out over her shoulder. "Do you see who it is?" "Who is it?" Wes asked, wondering if his daughter already met her teacher before tonight's event. Both Kenzie and Ally shrugged before hurrying to the front of the line. Wes tried to call out to her, a failed attempt at getting her to wait next to him. "Don't worry." Steph laughed and waved it off as she stood next to him. "Brenna lives for nights like this. She's the most patient first grade teacher I've ever met." "Brenna Gibson?" Steph responded with a smile. "It sure is. Well, she's Miss Gibson now, but she's still the same Brenna she was in high school." Wes studied the woman he'd known several years ago. Her blonde hair wasn't anything like he'd remembered. It was shorter now, just past her sun-kissed shoulders. But those blue eyes that focused on him now, they were still the same eyes he'd know anywhere. He quickly averted his attention away from Brenna and focused on Kenzie, who was now telling the woman all about moving to Silver Leaf Falls and how much she loved reading. Wes left Steph's side and approached his daughter as Brenna greeted them and handed Kenzie a bright pink folder filled with papers. "Dad," Kenzie said as she pulled out the contents of the folder. "Miss Gibson says that we're going to have a lot of fun in class." Wes took the papers and stuffed them back into the folder before tucking it underneath his arm. "We'll go through everything when we get home, Kenz." He looked up from his daughter and met Brenna's smile with one of his own. It had been years since he'd last seen her, and from what he could see, she hadn't changed much. She was still the same girl he used to know. "Welcome back to Silver Leaf Falls, Wes," she said with a friendly smile as she handed him a packet for parents. "I'm looking forward to having Ally and Kenzie in my class this year." Wes glanced over his shoulder as Steph approached his side. They had all been friends in school. It was funny how little things changed in a small town compared to life in the city. "Grandma Gertie," Kenzie called out as an older woman approached the booth in front of them. Wes smiled and waved at the woman he'd known for years. "I thought that was you," she said to Wes as she lifted Kenzie into her arms and gave her a hug. "All these years later and you're finally right where you belong." "Yes, ma'am," he said, unsure of what else he could say. Grandma Gertie was the busybody in town, making herself known among everyone while getting the scoop along the way. He had no doubt that she'd known he was back in town long before tonight. "It's good to be back. There's no doubt in my mind that you'll have a wonderful first grade year here," Grandma Gertie assured Kenzie, offering her another quick hug before setting her down in front of them. She snuck a glance at Brenna and turned back to Wes and Kenzie. You take care and let me know if you need anything. I'm going to venture over there and grab me a quick snack or two. She offered Kenzie a pat on the top of the head before turning and heading toward the concession stand. Wes looked at Brenna and shook his head. Some things never change, he said with a smile. Not around here, they don't, Brenna said, handing another child their folder. Grandma Gertie is proof of that. Wes shared a laugh with Brenna before asking Kenzie if she was ready to go. Of course, Kenzie was nowhere close to being ready. She wanted to use the photo props Brenna had displayed next to the booth and couldn't wait to get a picture with her new teacher. Over here, Dad, Kenzie called out, standing behind a cardboard frame. Take my picture. Wes pulled out his phone and angled his camera just right to capture the perfect shot of his little girl. She was having the time of her life while posing for pictures with Brenna and Ally. He watched Brenna interact with the young kids and realized he hadn't expected Kenzie's first-grade teacher to be her. He had lost touch with everyone in town when he moved on with his life, and he never expected Brenna to stick around. A part of him always thought she would leave town and never look back, like most of the rest of them. He'd been wrong. It was more than obvious that Brenna was right where she belonged. Would you like me to take a picture of you guys with the kids? Brenna asked as she approached him and Steph. I'm not a professional when it comes to taking pictures, but I'm sure I can manage a good picture or two if you'd like. Wes glanced at Steph, puzzled why Brenna offered to get a picture of the four of them together. Steph stepped back and laughed, leaving a confused expression on Brenna's face. Wes caught on to the mishap a moment later and politely corrected Brenna. You can take a picture of me and Kenzie, but we're not together, Steph interrupted, finishing Wes's sentence for him. Brenna's cheeks flushed red as she took a step back. I'm sorry. I just thought. It's okay, Wes said, taking a step forward and handing Brenna his phone. You can take a picture of Ken's and me if you'd like. Brenna's embarrassment quickly turned to excitement as she accepted his offer. Wes headed toward the photo booth and stepped beside Kenzie. This is the best night ever, Dad. It is, isn't it? Wes looked down at his daughter, who was looking up at him with her soft blue eyes and loving smile. He'd do anything in the world to keep that smile on her face, even if it meant taking silly pictures with props. Say cheese, Brenna called out, giving Wes and Kenzie a split second to smile before a flash lit up from the back of the phone. Wes squinted with a laugh. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't take a good picture with the flash on. Let's try one more time. Smile, Dad, Kenzie said through gritted teeth, holding strong to her smile. I am, Ken's. He forced his eyes open as the flash resumed, thankful to have the chance of taking at least one decent photo with his daughter. He couldn't wait to see the pictures, while knowing he more than likely looked like a weirdo trying to keep his eyes wide with a smile on his face. Brenna approached them with his phone in hand and held it out to him. I think I've captured plenty of memories for the two of you. Her voice was sweet, just as he remembered from high school. She'd always been shy, and that was something he'd always liked about her. Wes shook away his thoughts and smiled as he accepted his phone back. Thank you, he said before turning to leave. Brenna grabbed Kenzie's folder from a nearby table and called after them, don't forget this. Wes thanked her again and wrapped an arm around Kenzie's shoulders as they headed toward the truck. I really like her, Dad, Kenzie said as she climbed into the passenger seat and allowed him to buckle her in. Do you like her, too? He acknowledged his daughter's question with a smile, but left it at that. Of course, he liked Brenna. The entire town, including Grandma Gertie, knew all about that.
Chapter 4. Brenna waved as Wes and Kenzie drove off, heading down Main Street away from the crowd. She couldn't believe she'd mistaken Wes and Steph as a couple. Thankfully, the two of them had laughed it off and Brenna could breathe a little easier after the mishap. She wasn't exactly sure how or why she'd put the wrong pieces together without realizing they didn't fit. It made sense as she thought about what she now knew. Steph was living with her sister, and though she had 2 children, Kenzie wasn't one of them. Brenna wasn't sure whether or not she was relieved at that tidbit of information. It was good to see Wes and Kenzie here tonight. Brenna turned, abandoning her thoughts and facing Grandma Gertie. Gertie offered Brenna a chocolate cupcake and said, "Kenzie's just the sweetest." There's no doubt in my mind that Wes is succeeding at raising that little girl alone after all these years. Brenna hadn't heard too much about Wes once he'd left town after high school. She would be lying if she said it hadn't surprised her to see a child by his side. If Kenzie weren't a spitting image of Wes, Brenna would have had a harder time believing it. "Would you like some help cleaning up?" Grandma Gertie asked, busying herself with stacking props from the photo booth and placing them into a plastic tote. "I don't think I've told you lately how much I enjoy working with you and the children." "You tell me every day, Gert," Brenna said with a smile as she finished the last bite of her cupcake. It was scrumptious, and she was thankful Gertie thought of her while out and about on the green. "How soon I forget," Gertie teased, offering Brenna a mischievous grin. "But I suppose it doesn't hurt to say it again. I look forward to volunteering this year." Brenna's heart melted at Gertie's words. Being a wonderful teacher was Brenna's top priority. She wanted to give every one of her students a successful start to their education. "I know I say that every year," Gertie continued on as she helped Brenna pick up the last of the decorations and photo booth props. "It's always nice to work alongside the teachers. You all are such a blessing to these kiddos." "Well, thank you," Brenna said with a soft smile. "I think you're pretty great, too. And we appreciate everything you do for the kids at the elementary school and in our classes." "I'm just doing what I love most," Gertie said, waving it off like it was no big deal. Brenna knew better. The older woman had years of experience while living in Silverleaf Falls, and her love of kids was something Brenna admired. Gertie could be the busybody of town all day long and know everything about everyone, but when it came down to it, she was an asset and Brenna was more than blessed to have her involved. "Now tell me what you know about Wes." Brenna should have known the request was coming. It never took Gertie long before she dove into the missing details. Brenna tried to play it off as though she hadn't thought about Wes, but as she stammered on her words, Gertie gave her a knowing look that called Brenna's bluff. "Aside from the fact that we went to school together?" "Of course," Gertie said, pulling up a couple of chairs and motioning for Brenna to take a seat. Brenna looked around as her stomach growled. It was getting later in the evening, way past supper time, and she had planned to meet with Steph at Sizzle and Sip. There's always more to a story than what meets the eye. Brenna glanced at the time on her Fitbit and decided she had a few minutes to spare. She would feed Gertie's curiosity with as little information as she could without going into too many details of the past versus the present. Except she didn't know where to start. Did she mention her first impression of him after all these years? Despite the passing of time, he could still make her heart skip a beat or two. Gertie didn't need to know any of that, so Brenna kept it to the basics. It would do her good to stay focused on her own life without getting wrapped up in all things Wes Davis anyway. "He seems to be a good father," Brenna said. That much was true. "You know he would do anything for that little girl of his," Gertie said matter-of-factly, with a smile. "After everything he's been through, he's still one of the good ones." Brenna leaned back in her chair and thought about what Gertie said. She hadn't the slightest idea what Wes had gone through once he left town, but come to think of it, where was his wife? She'd heard he'd gotten married a few months after moving to the city with Nicole. "I heard through the grapevine that he's starting at Silverleaf Stables," Gertie said. "You've always liked horses, haven't you?" Brenna laughed and shook her head, knowing right where Gertie was going with that tidbit of information. "Yes, but that doesn't mean I'm going to find my way to the stables." Gertie offered a candid shrug and said, "One never knows where the path to happiness will lead." Brenna shook her head with another laugh as she gave the notion a dismissive wave. There would be no way she would find her way to the stables, no matter if the path led her there or not. She would take a detour and find her way back to her comfort zone. "I'm just saying, is all," Gertie said, slapping her hands on her knees before standing. "Things might be different now between the two of you than it was in high school." Brenna sat back, shocked that Gertie could have known anything about the two of them in high school. Not that it mattered, because at this point it was just a blip of a memory. I suppose there will be several opportunities in the coming weeks for the two of you to become reacquainted anyhow, Gertie said, interrupting the silence between them as they finished packing everything into totes. Brenna figured Gertie was right. There were several events in the upcoming week, and plenty more to last through the entire school year, which would include parents and other volunteers. Gertie helped load Brenna's SUV, strategically placing the totes in the back to make them fit just right. Brenna shut the hatch and turned to face Gertie with a thankful smile. "Thank you for your help, Gert. I appreciate you more than words could ever say." Gertie offered a soft smile that warmed Brenna's heart as the woman she had known for years wrapped her in a loving embrace. "I believe this year will be the best one yet." "You say that every year, Gert," Brenna said with a slight laugh. "Will I see you tomorrow?" "Tomorrow?" Gertie asked, confusion knitting her eyebrows. "What's tomorrow?" "I'll be spending the day in my classroom," Brenna reminded her. "You always help me get everything prepared and organized for the new students. But if you're busy, that's okay, I'm sure I can handle it." Brenna offered Gertie an out, to which the woman refused with a quick shake of her head. No. I'll be there with bells on." Brenna laughed at the thought of Gertie's rambunctious personality and knew all too well that Gertie would follow through on that promise. "Okay, do you want me to call you when I'm on my way to the school?" Gertie paused a minute before asking, "What about having breakfast first?" "Meet me at Ruby's? Let's say, 8 o'clock? Brenna smiled with a nod. She would never turn down breakfast with Gertie. "You've got it. I'll see you then. It's a date." Gertie patted Brenna on the arm and offered her a quick wink before heading toward another booth filled with people packing up after the event. Brenna double-checked the latch on her SUV and smiled as she thought about the evening's event. She'd met plenty of children who were overjoyed to start their first day of school. Several had told her all about their fun-packed summers, and though some were sad that summer was ending, they couldn't wait to see all of their friends again. As she backed out of her parking spot, Brenna thought about Wes and Kenzie. If what Gertie had mentioned was true about Wes starting at the stables, Brenna's love of horses could help her connect with Kenzie on a more personal level as she helped the little girl get settled into starting at a new school. Not that she wanted to favor one student over the other, but she wanted to make sure Kenzie felt right at home.
Chapter 5. What do you say we grab a bite to eat before we look through what Miss Gibson gave us? Yes. His little girl nodded excitedly as Wes turned the truck around and headed back to the not-so-crowded Main Street. The event was winding down, and everyone was packing up and heading home. He couldn't help but scan the green for any sign of Brenna as they drove. He would be lying if he told himself that she hadn't sparked something inside of him. Something he hadn't thought twice about since moving out of town and marrying the love of his life. A familiar feeling had snuck its way to the forefront of his mind and he had locked eyes on Brenna. "Is Sizzle and Sip okay? Or would you like to go somewhere else for supper?" Wes asked as he looked for a place to park his truck. Sizzle and Sip had become their go-to restaurant, and Wes wouldn't deny the fact it had always been one of his favorites in town. With Kenzie's approval, Wes pulled into a vacant spot on a side street and shifted his old truck into park. He wasn't sure if there would be room to dine, or if they would have to take their food to go, but they were both hungry and Sizzle and Sip was calling their names. Kenzie swiped the folder off the seat beside her and clutched it to her chest as she climbed out of the truck. No matter how hard Wes tried to insist she leave it on the seat, Kenzie refused to let go of it. "Okay, maybe we can look through it while we're waiting for our food." If there was one thing Wes had learned during the struggle of being a single father, it came down to compromise. Negotiating with a 6-year-old could be trying at times, and thankfully, he'd learned to pick his battles fairly quickly. He held the door open for his daughter as she marched into the diner proudly. She was a force to be reckoned with and took after her mother in more ways than one. Both a comforting and painful reminder of Wes's divorce. "Hi, guys," Lori Knight called out from behind the counter. Wes waved with a smile as they made their way further inside the restaurant. "Go ahead and find a seat," she directed. "We're extremely busy tonight as you can see, but I'll send Carlos or Robin over in a minute or two to take your order." Wes nodded before he scanned the crowded diner, looking for a vacant spot to sit with his daughter. Just when he thought about changing his mind and taking their food to go, he spotted an empty booth near the back corner by the window. He guided Kenzie toward the booth, thankful to have found it amongst the crowd. He recognized several people from his younger years of growing up in town, and there was no doubt they recognized him as well. Many welcomed him and his daughter back to Silver Leaf Falls as they made their way to the booth. Wes politely acknowledged each person, all determined to sit down before losing a spot to sit. "They have coloring sheets now, Dad," Kenzie pointed out as she slid into the booth across from him. She looked so big sitting there, Wes couldn't help but wonder where the years had gone. It seemed like just the other day they were bringing her home from the hospital, changing diapers, and surviving a lack of sleep during random hours of feeding. Even with crayons lying in front of her as she busied herself with coloring the dinosaur on the sheet, Wes still saw her as his baby girl. It was hard to think that she was starting first grade in just a few days. She would graduate before too long as the years flew by. He shook the thought away and focused on the moment instead. He had plenty of time to figure everything out between now and then. The last thing he wanted to do was waste time worrying about the future. "What can I get the two of you to drink?" A teenage boy named Carlos, according to his name tag, stood at the edge of their booth with a pad of paper in hand ready to take notes. Kenzie didn't take more than a second to tell the server what she wanted. "I'll have a pink lemonade, please." "You got it." Wes watched as the young boy scribbled on the paper before asking for a Pepsi. "I'll be back in a few minutes with your drinks and to take your order," Carlos said. He handed Wes an adult menu and provided Kenzie with a paper filled with a choice for kids and another picture to color on the back. Wes scanned over the menu, not too sure on what he wanted at the moment. The bell above the door rang out, and instinctively, Wes caught himself looking up to see who had walked in. Brenna Gibson entered the diner confidently, her blonde hair falling just below her shoulders as she greeted those around her with a friendly smile. Watching the way she interacted with everyone brought several memories to Wes's mind. There wasn't a hint of insecurity about that girl then or even now. Sure, she had been shy and a book nerd back in the day. Which only made sense now that she was a teacher, but still. Kenzie continued coloring the pictures provided by the diner as Wes watched Brenna interact and mingle while she scanned the place for a spot to sit. Wes already knew she would have a hard time finding a spot. There wasn't a single table open in the crowded diner. He thought about flagging her over, giving her a spot to sit down with them, but thought twice when he realized she might be there to meet with her coworkers or maybe even a friend. A thought that suddenly hit him. Blindsided him, actually. He scanned the diner, looking for a booth occupied by a solo male who might be waiting for Brenna to join him. Not that he cared. He wasn't interested in Brenna like that. He hadn't come home looking for a relationship. He'd come home in search of comfort and familiarity as he worked through everything he and Kenzie had endured. Carlos made his way over to their booth to take their order at the same time Kenzie spotted Brenna among the crowd. She waved at her new teacher and motioned for Brenna to come say hello. During the commotion, Wes tried to give their order to Carlos, but hadn't decided on what he wanted yet. He tried to focus on the menu and choose something quickly, but he couldn't decide quickly enough before Carlos glanced over his shoulder and turned back to Wes. "If you'd like, I can give you a few more minutes." Wes nodded as Brenna approached their booth with an excited smile plastered on her face. "Hi, Kenzie," Brenna said. "Wes." She looked from Wes back to Kenzie and said, "Are you having supper with Dad tonight?" "Uh-huh." Kenzie nodded proudly before saying, "You can join us if you want." Wes nearly choked on the drink he'd just taken. It shouldn't have surprised him that his daughter would invite her teacher to sit with them. "I'm sure Miss Gibson has somewhere else to." "Actually, I don't," Brenna interrupted with a shy smile. She looked down at her phone and sighed. "I was supposed to meet with Steph tonight, but it looks like she had to cancel at the last minute." Kenzie slid over in the booth across from Wes and patted the spot next to her. "Sit down, Miss Gibson," Kenzie said with an innocent smile. Wes had no choice but to go along with his daughter's invitation. Brenna did as Kenzie asked, looking at Wes with an apologetic grin as she slid in next to his daughter. He offered a polite smile, ignoring the thumping of his heart in his chest. He glanced around the diner, looking for any sign of Grandma Gertie. One split second was all it would take for the rumors to fly around town about Wes and Brenna having supper together at the local diner. "Look at the dinosaur I colored, Miss Gibson," Kenzie said, displaying her masterpiece proudly in front of her new teacher. "I stayed in the lines, too." Brenna's face lit up with a smile as she acknowledged Kenzie's claim. "Good job. That's a very colorful dinosaur you have there." "Her name is Lucy," Kenzie stated proudly as she set the paper down and took a drink of her lemonade. "We used to have a dog named Lucy, but we had to get rid of her." Wes's stomach dropped as Brenna's smile turned into a saddened frown. He tried to explain, Lucy was well loved, but she was getting old. Wes's words trailed off as recognition and understanding filled Brenna's eyes. He hadn't handled the loss of their family pet the best. He could have explained it better to Kenzie. Apparently better than he had, so she wouldn't think they had just gotten rid of their beloved pet. "Have you ordered yet?" Brenna asked, tucking her purse against her side in between her and Kenzie. Wes shook his head. "I can't figure out what I want." Brenna looked down at Kenzie and asked, "Do you know what you're having?" Kenzie was quick to respond with an overzealous nod as she pointed at the kids' menu. Of course, she would settle on her favorite meal, macaroni and cheese and chicken nuggets. "That's an excellent choice," Brenna said. "That was my favorite when I was your age." "It was?" Kenzie asked, looking up with a fascinated sparkle in her eye. Wes let out a light chuckle and said, "Looks like you found a new best friend." Kenzie flipped her menu over and offered Brenna a few crayons before asking, "Would you like to color with me?" "I would love to." Brenna accepted the crayons and shot a look at Wes, who had no choice but to smile. It was good to see the two of them building a connection before school started. It relieved him to know that starting at a new school might not be all that bad since Kenzie liked her teacher. "Are you ready to order now?" Carlos asked politely as he approached their booth. Of course, Wes still hadn't decided because of the slight distraction from a friendly blonde now sitting at their table. But he wouldn't make Carlos come back a third time to take their order. Wes allowed the girls to order first, realizing a minute later that Brenna ordered what he'd considered ordering as well. Before he thought about how weird it would be if he ordered exactly what she had, he spit it out and caught a glance from Brenna. She smiled as she nudged Kenzie. "It looks like your dad's having what I'm having," Brenna mentioned to Kenzie while keeping her eyes locked on Wes. "I love their cheeseburgers so much. And their steak fries are to die for. That's what I'll eat when I get older, too," Kenzie said with a proud look on her face. "Just like my dad." It didn't take long before Carlos brought their food to them. They conversed while they ate, but Kenzie did most of the talking while leaving both Wes and Brenna in a fit of laughter as she shared silly stories. If Wes were to be honest, he wished the evening out hadn't gone by as fast as it had. He'd enjoyed himself during the impromptu date with Kenzie's teacher. Regardless of how certain he was about not wanting a relationship, he couldn't help thinking twice about Brenna and what they once shared as they each said goodbye and left in opposite directions.
Chapter 6. Breakfast was just as Brenna remembered as she sat across from Grandma Gertie. Meeting Gertie at Ruby's had been a wonderful idea and a great start to the day. Or at least until Gertie started asking questions about what she'd heard from the evening before. "So how was supper last night, dear?" "It was good," Brenna said. "As always. But Steph's babysitter canceled on her, so I." "Found yourself with a special someone?" Gertie waggled her eyebrows as she took a bite of French toast. "Or at least that's what I've heard from a few good friends of mine anyway." Brenna tried to hide from Gertie's knowing glances by stuffing a giant bite of blueberry pancake into her mouth. She felt the warmth creep into her cheeks and knew it was too late. Gertie caught on quickly and affirmed the rumor to be true. "There's nothing to be ashamed of, dear," Gertie said before taking a bite of crispy bacon. "I'm not ashamed," Brenna said confidently. Ashamed wasn't at all how she felt when recalling the evening's events. "I think it thrilled Kenzie to have me join them for supper. Wes, not so much." Brenna thought about the look Wes had made when his daughter invited her to sit down with them. She'd always known Wes to be somewhat of a private guy, and she could tell he was worried about getting rumors started around town. Of course, according to Gertie, his worries had been confirmed. "I'm sure they both enjoyed the company," Gertie assured her as she finished off her breakfast. Brenna bounced the thought around a few times before saying, "I'm not sure Wes was thrilled, but..." Gertie shook her head and said, "I'm sure he was just fine with having you join them. You two were really good friends at one time. I'm sure you have a lot of catching up to do." Gertie's question was more of a statement as Brenna thought about it for a minute. It was true that she and Wes had been close friends at one time. They'd spent summers riding bikes around town and many summer nights at Otter Creek, riding horses and skipping rocks. Brenna hadn't seen herself falling in love with him until it was too late. He'd proposed to Nicole, homecoming queen and Miss Popular, soon after graduating from high school. "I think it'll do you both some good to spend more time together," Gertie insisted, keeping her gaze on Brenna. "Reconnect after all these years." Brenna shook her head. "I don't think so." Gertie clucked her tongue with a quick shake of her head, but she let it rest for a bit while allowing Brenna to finish her breakfast. Brenna wasn't sure why Gertie liked the idea of reconnecting with Wes. The past was the past, and even though he was back in town for a fresh start, Brenna was not interested in getting caught up with her student's father. "You know what they say, dear," Gertie said, breaking the silence as Brenna placed the used napkin on her plate and set her fork down. Brenna raised a brow, encouraging Gertie to finish her thought. "The best relationships start off as friendships first." Brenna couldn't help but shake her head yet again. No matter what Gertie thought, she and Wes wouldn't revisit that time in their life. "Who's to say he's here to stay?" Brenna asked. But she quickly corrected it by saying, "Not that it matters, because I'm not interested." Gertie cracked a knowing smile. One that called Brenna's bluff, but Brenna ignored it. "I have a feeling that you would know the answer to your question if you were to ask him yourself." Brenna furrowed her brows. "And how exactly am I supposed to ask him that?" "Excuse me, Wes, but are you actually here to stay this time around, or are you going to leave town again like you did before?" Gertie shifted in her seat as she subtly cleared her throat, a failed attempt to get Brenna to cut the act as Wes approached their table. "Wes," Brenna said, swallowing down the embarrassment that threatened to overwhelm her. "I didn't know you were. The Everses are working on some things at the motel, so I offered to come into town and grab breakfast for everyone," Wes said, his attention focused directly on her. She felt like a heel. The size of a mole on the back of a gremlin's neck. "Morning, Gert." Gertie greeted him with a cheesy grin as Brenna thought about making a run for the door. She'd been caught mid-act, overdramatically speaking from past hurt and old memories. "To answer your question," Wes said, interrupting Brenna's panicked thoughts and pulling her attention back to him. "I'm here to stay. For good. Kenzie needs a fresh start as much as I do without the constant reminder of our old life." She tried to talk. Tried to open her mouth to remove the foot she'd placed deep inside, but no words came out. She closed her mouth and ducked her head in embarrassment. "How are Bill and Jane Evers coming along with that motel of theirs?" Gertie asked. Brenna was more than thankful the woman had taken Wes's focus away from her. She made a mental note to find him by himself and apologize. "I heard their son, Reese, will be making a return to town here soon, though it's a shame about the circumstances." Brenna had heard the news of Bill's upcoming surgery, but everyone knew he would be back on his feet in no time at all. "They're managing just fine for now," Wes said, glancing over his shoulder as a woman called out to him from behind the counter and held up 2 plastic bags of to-go boxes. "I'm sure once Reese arrives in town, they'll be able to rest a bit more." Gertie accepted Wes's explanation with a quick nod before ushering him along. "We've kept you long enough, dear. Go ahead and get your food," she said as she looked up at him. "We'll be sure to catch up another time." Brenna caught Wes's quick glance her way and refocused on the empty plate in front of her. She'd seen an uncertainty in his eyes that she'd never seen before now. She should have thought twice before acting out in public. "Well, if there was a chance to reconnect with him," Brenna started, "I'm pretty sure that I just blew it." She released a sigh as Gertie reached across the table and rested a hand on top of hers. She offered Brenna a gentle pat and said, "I'm sure you didn't ruin your chance, but I must say you're pretty good at acting. You could have landed yourself a career as an actress." Brenna ignored Gertie's playfulness and thought about Wes and the way he looked at her while standing next to her. She didn't know his story. And she didn't want to know, really. But she couldn't dismiss the nagging question demanding an answer: what happened between him and Nicole? "I think we should bring Brownie back to the reading circle," Brenna said as she unpacked a few things from a tote and set the black and brown grizzly teddy bear down next to her on the desk. "The kids seem to enjoy reading out loud a lot more when they have him sitting in their laps." Gertie walked over to Brenna's desk and picked up the old teddy bear. "He's definitely seen better days, but I'd have to agree that the kids might like to meet him this year." Brenna stacked a pile of books neatly on the edge of the desk and thought about what this year would entail. She enjoyed reading time with her kids each and every year. It allowed growth and opportunity to work through troublesome words as a group when she encouraged each student to read aloud. "I think Brownie would help Kenzie more than anyone," Gertie said as she set the bear back down on Brenna's desk. "She's been through a lot in the last 2 years, and if I'm being honest, which I always am, she needs all the comfort she can get this year." Brenna stopped stacking books and looked at Gertie. "What do you mean?" When Gertie hesitated to answer, Brenna said, I know starting at a new school is sometimes really hard for kids her age." Brenna's words trailed off as she thought about what Gertie wasn't saying. Something happened between Wes and Nicole, causing Wes to move back home. Had he realized the city life wasn't all it was cracked up to be? But why would Nicole allow him to take Kenzie with him? It seemed odd that a mother would allow her child to move away with their father. "I should let Wes explain things for himself, but you need to know before waiting too much longer," Gertie said as she stuck posters on the whiteboard behind them. Brenna watched as Gertie busied herself with the task at hand and waited patiently for the woman she knew her whole life to explain what Brenna had yet to figure out. "Seems that the presumed happily ever after once you're married isn't always how it goes." Brenna thought about it for a minute before Gertie explained, "I've heard through the grapevine that Nicole was fine at first. Of course, it was her idea to move to the city anyway, so why wouldn't she be?" Gertie shook her head as she looked down at her folded hands in her lap. Brenna could tell that it bothered Gertie a bit to let her in on the reason Wes was back in town. "I guess the honeymoon phase wore off some time after Kenzie was born, but the two of them tried to work things out the best they could. Just recently, in the last year or so, Nicole asked for a divorce and said she wanted to move on with her life and explore her options." Brenna eased herself into the chair at her desk as she slowly put the pieces together. Her heart broke before Gertie had a chance to break it down for her. "From what I've heard, she basically filed for a divorce and took off to another state in search of greener pastures, as they say." Brenna gasped and swallowed the emotion threatening to escape as she continued putting the pieces together. She had no idea how a woman could do such a thing, let alone a mother. Her heart broke for Wes and his little girl. "Wes tried his best to make her stay, but there was nothing he could do once Nicole's mind was made up," Gertie said, her voice just above a heartbroken whisper. "Since hearing about the divorce, we've all been hoping they would just come back home and let us help them." Brenna was beside herself with the news. Looking back, how had she not paid attention to the talk around town? Had she known, she would have reached out like any old friend would have done and made sure he knew she was there for him. "I'm sure he's returned to Silver Leaf Falls looking for not only a fresh start, but as a way to cope without the daily reminders of the life he once had." Brenna took a deep breath and released it slowly. Everything made perfect sense now, and no matter what had happened in the past between her and Wes, she needed him to know that she would be there for him and Kenzie. "Do you mind setting a few more things up while I'm gone?" Brenna asked as she reached for her purse and fished for her car keys. Gertie shot her a questioning look, but gladly agreed to stick around the classroom and get things organized. "I'll be back soon," Brenna called out over her shoulder as she made her way out the door. She needed to find Wes and not only tell him how sorry she was for earlier that morning, but to offer him a renewal of the friendship they'd once had.
Chapter 7. To say it had surprised him to see Brenna with Gertie at Ruby's would have been a misguided understatement. He hadn't had time to say hello before overhearing Brenna talk about their past. He'd heard the hurt in her voice even as he caught her mid-act, questioning whether he was back in town for good. He set the plastic bags down in the motel's office and thought about missing that entire conversation if he hadn't agreed to get breakfast for the motel. He shrugged away the thought, dismissing the way Brenna had looked at him when she caught him standing nearby. The way Gertie had tried talking Brenna into mending their broken friendship. Reminding Wes of what the two of them shared in the past. When he announced his proposal and how excited he had been that Nicole said yes, he had paid little attention to Brenna's reaction. Now it all made perfect sense. "Dad!" Kenzie announced her arrival downstairs as Wes heard padded footsteps behind him. "What did you get?" Wes shook away the troubling thoughts as he focused on his daughter. He pulled the to-go containers from the 2 plastic bags and stacked them on the small table behind the check-in desk. "How does blueberry pancakes with cream cheese sound?" "Yum!" Jane Evers called out as she entered the dining area. "I'd say that sounds delicious, don't you, Kenz?" "Yes," his daughter squealed beside him, famished and ready to eat breakfast while still wearing her footed pajamas. She clutched the teddy bear Nicole had bought her the day of surgery to remove her tonsils. It had been the last gift her mother had given her before deciding to leave them. "I'm hungry, Dad." His little girl rubbed her stomach as if to soothe the growls rumbling around. Wes slid out a chair for Kenzie to sit down in before preparing her pancakes with cream cheese. "Not for long," Wes said with a smile as he drove the plate like an airplane, making a pit stop in front of her. "Crash landing," he called out, making an explosion sound with his mouth. Kenzie lost it in a fit of laughter before grabbing a fork and taking a giant bite of her pancake. Jane approached the counter and thanked him for picking up breakfast. "How much do we owe you?" she asked over the stack of takeout containers. Wes waved it off and dismissed it with a polite, "Don't worry about it. It's the least I can do." Jane's eyes filled with tears as she fought to hold them back. With her husband's upcoming hip replacement surgery, it truly was the least he could do. When the motel needed repairs, Wes wanted them to know they could count on him. Without them, he wouldn't have had a place to stay when he moved back to town. He owed them more than just blueberry pancakes and repairing a few things around the motel. "I was going to mention it the other day, but with Kenzie having back-to-school night and meeting her teacher," Wes started as he slid into a chair next to his daughter, "I got preoccupied and it slipped my mind until now." Jane turned her attention to Wes and motioned for him to continue while she took a bite of food. "Kenzie and I will be moving to Silver Leaf Stables," Wes stated proudly, knowing it was the first time Kenzie heard about it. He hadn't meant to postpone the news, but it was better now than later. "That's wonderful," Jane said, stealing another pancake from the platter before smothering it with cream cheese and syrup. "I knew you'd leave Dax no choice but to hire you. Are we going to sleep in the stables with the horses, Dad?" Kenzie's face twisted in confusion, and Wes's heart melted. He let out a light chuckle and shook his head. "As much as you would love that, I'm afraid not." Kenzie furrowed her brow and asked, "Then where are we going to sleep?" Jane smiled and answered for Wes. "I believe Dax has a nice solo cabin on the ranch that you and your father will live in." She looked to Wes for confirmation and Wes nodded. "That's right. Dax is going to let us stay there for however long we need to. I'll be working alongside Dax and doing what ranch hands do best." Kenzie seemed to accept his explanation without giving it more thought before finishing her breakfast and asking for another pancake. His little girl was growing up and getting quite the appetite. He placed another pancake on her plate and offered another slice of bacon as well. They continued eating in silence until Kenzie interrupted it by asking, "Will I get my own horse?" Wes shared a laugh with Jane. He hadn't thought about what living on the ranch would entail for his daughter, but he could ask Dax about riding lessons for Kenzie. "I'm not sure about all of that, but maybe Dax has someone who can give you riding lessons or at least let you ride now and then. Maybe Ally can come see the horses, too." "I don't see why not," Wes said, "but we'll have to approve it with Dax first, okay?" Kenzie agreed to that with a quick nod. She pushed her plate to the side of the table and reached for the folder they'd received from Brenna. He had wanted to wait to go through it together after breakfast was finished and cleaned up, but he chose his battles and went along with it. He finished eating the last of his pancake as he watched her pull everything out of the folder and flip through each paper. It was obvious she was searching for something by the way she studied each page before flipping to the next. She stopped flipping papers when she reached the All About Me page. "Look, Dad," Kenzie said, holding it up so he could see it. The paper offered information all about Brenna and included an accurate summary of Brenna's background in teaching. "It's all about Miss Gibson." "I see that," Wes said, studying the page in front of him. He already knew a lot about Brenna. It didn't surprise him that she'd created a paper like the one his daughter was holding. She'd always been creative with an artistic flair. "What does it say?" He listened and followed along as Kenzie read him the teacher's notes on the page. Every square was filled in, leaving nothing uncovered, from Brenna's favorite food to her favorite color, and it had a beautiful summer photo to boot. Kenzie passed the paper to him as she went back to digging through the packet. "Look," she exclaimed as she held up a blank All About Me in front of him. She included one for me, too. Excitement radiated from his daughter in waves as she asked, "Can you help me fill it out?" "Please, Dad." Wes couldn't say no to those pleading blue eyes as his little girl stared up at him with her hands folded in front of her. "Okay," Wes finally said with a slight grin. "Do you have something to write with?" Kenzie searched behind the check-in desk but came up empty-handed. Jane smiled and pointed toward the office. "I'm pretty sure there might be crayons or pencils in the top drawer of my desk." She turned and called after Kenzie, "Let me know if you need my help, Kenz." Kenzie scurried off in search of something to write with while he stretched his legs and tossed their breakfast scraps into a nearby trash can. There was nothing like spending time with his daughter. He would take every minute he could get while knowing summer was ending and their time would be limited during the day. Kenzie returned with a handful of crayons and climbed up to the table. He sat down next to her and offered to help her with the first question, and the front door of the motel opened and footsteps sounded behind them in the lobby. Both Kenzie and Wes looked over to see who had arrived, and it didn't take long for it to register with his daughter. "Miss Gibson." Kenzie shouted, squirming out of her chair and racing away from the table. "What are you doing here?" Wes met Brenna's gaze with his own. He hadn't expected her to show up at the motel. He offered a polite smile and a friendly wave as he waited for his daughter to return back to her chair beside him. "We just finished breakfast," Kenzie announced joyfully as she led Brenna into the kitchen. "Dad was going to help me with this paper now that we're done eating, and I helped clean up the table." Brenna's face lit up with a smile as she looked at Wes. "Is that right?" "Yep," Kenzie stated happily. "Dad says I'm good at helping." "That's good to hear because I'm looking for a good helper in the classroom," Brenna said as she knelt down in front of Kenzie. "Would you like to be my helper when school starts?" Wes watched his daughter's eyes light up. "Yes." "Okay, I'll keep that in mind then," Brenna said as Kenzie wrapped her tiny arms around her teacher's neck and thanked her. Wes watched the interaction between Brenna and his daughter. He couldn't help but notice how it made him feel to see the two of them get along so well. A sense of security now replaced every doubt he had about his daughter's first year at a new school. "Did you find the coloring pages I tucked into the folder for you?" Brenna straightened and led Kenzie to the table that displayed the contents of the folder. Kenzie climbed into the chair and helped dig through the pile until they found what they were looking for. Wes walked over to the table and peeked over his daughter's shoulder at the outline of a bouquet waiting to be colored in. Brenna's gaze met his for a split second before she asked Kenzie, "Do you want to color that while I have a talk with your father?" Kenzie wasted no time getting started as she reached for the crayons she'd placed on the table. Wes wasn't sure what Brenna had to talk to him about, but if it had anything to do with Kenzie and starting school, he was all ears. Without missing a beat, he kissed his daughter on the top of the head and led Brenna onto the front porch outside the office. He held the door open for her and allowed her to lead the way over to the wicker chairs before sitting down next to her. "What's up?" Brenna's smile faded as she looked him in the eye. Oh. This can't be good." "Gertie told me something," Brenna started, folding her hands in her lap. Wes raised a brow. He wasn't sure what there was for Gertie to tell Brenna that she wouldn't have already known. "And I just want to say, I'm sorry." He cleared his throat and leaned back in the chair. Sorry for what? He asked, realizing whatever Gertie had told Brenna had troubled her something fierce. What did Gertie tell you? The thought of Gertie telling Brenna something ridiculous crossed his mind. He wouldn't put it past the woman to share some kind of rumor she'd heard around town about him. Nothing really, Brenna said, wringing her hands in her lap. Whatever it was had her questioning whether to tell him. He didn't like that. Well, it's gotta be something, Wes said, keeping his focus on Brenna and waiting for her to spill it. You didn't drive out all this way just to say sorry without an explanation. I'm not even sure there's a reason for your apology. He quickly thought over the last few days' worth of events in his mind but couldn't think of anything that would prompt Brenna to apologize. Whatever Gertie had to say, I'm sure it's just a rumor, Wes assured. You know how things get started in this small town. Brenna shook her head. I had no right to question why you're back in town or how long you're staying. It's really none of my business. Wes leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees as he looked Brenna in the eye. Bren, it's okay. I didn't take offense to any of it, he said with a subtle shrug. He tried making light of the conversation, still not sure what Gertie had told her that morning. And to be honest, I've already forgotten about it. He lied. He also wouldn't tell her that he couldn't stop thinking about her since the night they had reunited. He didn't miss the flash of uncertainty cross her face as she stood from the chair beside him. Okay, well, I guess I should probably get back to my classroom and finish setting things up, Brenna said in a hurry. Her summer dress flowed freely around her as she walked toward him. I just wanted to make sure you weren't upset with me. She reached out and placed her hand on top of his. Familiarity shot through him. She gasped before pulling away from him. Bren, wait. She made it to the porch steps before he caught up to her. He didn't want her to leave. He had a million things he wanted to tell her. He just wasn't sure how to say them. She studied him for a minute before breaking their eye contact. I shouldn't have come, she whispered over her shoulder as she walked down the front steps. Wes took a step forward, trying his best to stop her from leaving. Bren, he called out as he followed her to the driveway. Talk to me. What's all this about? Instead of waiting for him to catch up to her, Brenna was already sliding into the driver's seat of her car and shutting the door. She offered a quick wave before backing out of the driveway and heading back into town.
Chapter 8. She should have known better than to go in search of making things right. Wes had no idea the effect he had on her. Way back then, or even now, as she stood right in front of him. She wanted to tell him how sorry she was for what he and Kenzie had endured. Wanted to tell him that she always cared about him, as more than a friend. Brenna shook her head and tried her best to focus on forgetting that moment ever happened. One touch was all it took to remind her of everything she'd never told him. How much she'd cared about him and wanted nothing more than to be with him. He had been her best friend. They had shared so many memories together. Just when she had gotten the nerve to tell him how she felt, she feared he wouldn't reciprocate the same feelings and she'd let him go. Just like she had done a moment ago at the motel. She focused on the road ahead of her as she guided the car down Main Street and past the green, where they had reunited after so many years apart. Brenna pulled into the school's parking lot. Gertie would wait for her to return to the classroom. She would ask questions to figure out how the talk with Wes had gone. She loved Gertie like a grandmother, but she wasn't sure what the woman expected from Wes and Brenna. Brenna couldn't even say more than a few words to the man anymore, not without doubting herself. She climbed out of her car and shoved her keys into her purse before flinging the strap over her shoulder and walking toward the school's entrance. She loved the school and teaching more than anything in the world. She took a deep breath and released it as she approached her classroom. Sure enough, Gertie had busied herself with arranging the classroom and setting things up in Brenna's absence. Back so soon? Gertie greeted her with a smile. Brenna set her purse down on the edge of her desk and plopped into her chair. Oh. It didn't go as well as you thought. Brenna offered a slight shrug as she leaned forward, placing her arms on the desk. I apologized. She let out a heavy sigh and added, but now I'm not even sure why I went there. I have a feeling that it went better than what you're giving yourself credit for, Gertie said, a gleam in her eye as she looked at Brenna. If I know Wes, it did him some good to see you again. Brenna wasn't sure about all of that. Gertie reached out and patted Brenna's hand. In time, the two of you will be able to express how you truly feel about one another. Brenna wanted to disagree with Gertie. What did the woman know about how they felt about one another when Brenna wasn't even sure herself? Let's see what else there is to do before I head home for the day. Brenna blew off the conversation. Deep down, she knew Gertie was right, but that still didn't help settle her nerves after making a fool of herself. Gertie followed her over to the bookshelf, helping carry a stack of children's books and setting them down on the floor next to Brenna. Brenna arranged the books alphabetically, knowing they wouldn't stay arranged like that for long. Not that it mattered. It only mattered that her students had books to choose from, and she always loved seeing them read while in class. I remember when you and Wes were in first grade, Gertie said as she helped stack the books on the shelf. I always knew the two of you were the best of friends. Brenna smiled at the memory as she lined the books up next to one another. She had thought little about it back then. She'd been too busy reading books and enjoying school to think about boys. Or at least until she was a teenager and spent nights wondering what it would be like to fall in love with her best friend. If he hadn't left, I'd almost like betting that the two of you would have become the talk of this small town, Gertie said with a gleam in her eye. Brenna shook her head. I highly doubt that. Maybe if the two of you would have opened up with one another and told each other exactly how you felt. Gertie nudged Brenna with an elbow and said, "Tell me I'm wrong, and I'll drop it." Brenna let out a light laugh and shook her head. Don't lie. You won't drop it. Gertie used the shelf as a support as she straightened beside Brenna. You're right, but time will tell, and you'll see what I see when I watch the two of you. Brenna finished stacking the books on the shelf before standing and straightening her dress. She was about to argue with Gertie when heavy footsteps echoed into the classroom from the hallway. She exchanged glances with Gertie, who offered a confused shrug. It wasn't uncommon for teachers to come in and out of the school before the start of the school year, so Brenna didn't think too much about it until a familiar face rounded the corner and entered her room. Wes? Brenna's breath caught in her throat as she tried to calm her nerves. There was something about him that caused her heart to flutter and her mind to race. What are you doing here? Wes looked from Gertie back to Brenna and offered a slight shrug. Kenzie's helping Jane with some things around the motel, so I figured I'd swing by, Wes said with a grin. I figured I'd find you here. My next stop was going to be Chloe's bakery. Gertie smiled at Brenna and offered a quick wink before clapping her hands together. Well, I think I should probably get going. I have to meet up with the ladies for a daily gossip at the diner. Brenna searched the room for something for Gertie to do, but everything seemed to be done. The last few tasks that needed finished, she could handle on her own. Wes gave Gertie a quick hug on her way out the door, and Brenna froze in her spot. She couldn't believe he was standing there at the door. In her classroom. Wes took a step toward Brenna, closing the slight distance they had between them. She held her breath, trying her best to calm the racing of her heart and waiting for him to say something, anything that would explain why he had come to find her. He cleared his throat as he ran a hand through his short, blonde hair. His blue eyes focused on her as he seemed to search hers for all the answers. You didn't give me enough time to accept your apology, he said with a shy smile, attempting to break what little tension was now between them. Brenna slowly released her breath and tried to relax as she leaned on the bookshelf. It's accepted, by the way. She kept her eyes focused on the books lining the shelf. This classroom looks great, Wes said, changing the subject. It's warm and welcoming. Brenna offered a soft smile, allowing him to break down the wall she'd placed around her. I wouldn't want it any other way. I love being a teacher. Wes accepted what she said with a nod as he made his way closer and slid onto a nearby desk, shrinking the distance between them once again. You're good at it. It's obvious the kids love you, he said as he looked up at her. I know Kenzie does, for sure. I like her, too. Listen, Bren, Wes said, hesitating a minute before continuing, "I'm sorry for taking our friendship for granted all those years ago." "It's fine." Wes shook his head and stood up next to her. They were close now, almost too close as she could smell the familiar scent of his cologne and caught herself reminiscing about old memories of the two of them hanging out and spending time down at the creek so many times after school. Their parents had thought they'd get sick of each other one day, but just the opposite had happened. But it's really not. Otherwise, we would have picked up right where we left off. Wes reached out for her hand and took hold of it as he searched her eyes. She wasn't sure why he'd come to her classroom. She wasn't sure of a lot of things at that moment, but the one thing she was sure of was how attractive he was. That's probably my fault. I've been so busy," and her words caught in her throat. She was having a hard time forming a sentence as she stammered over her words and tried to organize her thoughts. "A lot has changed since the last time we saw each other, and I know we weren't all that close when I left." "Like I shoved aside our friendship without thinking about how it might have hurt you," Wes said, still holding onto her hand. Brenna glanced down at her hand and tried to relax. She wanted to argue with him. Tell him that she had been just fine when he left town. She'd been happy for him. "I'm really not good at this." Wes released a frustrated sigh as he let go of her hand. She felt the sudden loss of connection the moment it happened, and she wished he'd take hold of it again as he struggled to say whatever it was he had come to say. "I can only imagine what everyone's thinking," he said, combing another hand through his hair. "I come back to town and I'm supposed to be the same guy I was before I left. But I'm not." His words hit her like a ton of bricks. He was hurting. It might have taken Gertie telling her about what happened to him for Brenna to see it, but there had been signs that something wasn't right. "Losing someone you loved is hard, Wes," Brenna said, taking hold of his hand again and doing her best to comfort him. Storm clouds gathered in his eyes as he looked at her. She would do whatever she could to take away the pain she witnessed in that moment. "No one's going to judge you for coming home and starting over with your daughter." "But it's not just that's bugging me," he admitted. Wes hesitated a minute too long before adding, "I hurt many people when I left town. Even you. And then it hits me." He took a step back, releasing his hand from her grip as he looked around the room. "I should have never left town." It took everything Brenna had to keep her mouth from falling open. What was he talking about?
Chapter 9. There was so much he wanted to say, but he couldn't find the words to say now that he was face to face with Brenna. From the moment he first arrived in town to physically seeing her, it had reminded him of everything they shared between them. Sure, he'd left town, gotten married, and had a family of his own, but that didn't mean he never regretted leaving Brenna behind. "Don't say that." Wes could not only hear the pain in her voice, he could see it in her eyes as she looked up at him. A million thoughts tumbled through his mind. "There's nothing you have to regret," Brenna said as her eyes searched for answers to calm her confused expression. "You did what anyone would have done if given the opportunity. Proposing to a woman you love and building a life with her is hardly anything to regret. But I left you." The words were out of his mouth before he thought twice about what he was actually saying. Brenna's mouth opened as though she might say something before quickly closing it and shaking her head. The last thing he wanted was for Brenna to think he hadn't loved his wife. He'd loved her enough to marry her and have a beautiful daughter together. But he'd always felt like a part of him had been missing. Brenna's eyes flashed with realization when she figured out what he wasn't saying. "You've been through a lot. I know that must be hard, but you can't tell me you didn't love the life you shared with Nicole." Wes took a step back, adjusting the sleeve of his shirt as he tried his best to figure out how to explain what he meant and how he felt, the words he should have said years ago without allowing the fear of ruining their friendship to cause him to look for love elsewhere. "Of course, I loved Nicole and the life we had before our divorce," Wes explained. "But things weren't how I imagined they would be. I always had this emptiness. Like she wasn't fully committed to life with Kenzie and me. It created a longing for me to come back home. Nicole hadn't been happy in their marriage. Together, the two of them had everything they had ever wanted, or at least that's what he originally thought. He would be lying if he said the thought of what might have been with Brenna, if he hadn't feared messing up their friendship, never crossed his mind once his marriage failed and Nicole filed for divorce. Coming back home was supposed to be a breath of fresh air, he said, breaking the silence surrounding them. Brenna worried her bottom lip with her teeth, something she had always done when she was nervous and overthinking. But it has only been a reminder of what I walked away from. Brenna looked up at him with soft blue eyes, and he desperately wanted to leave and forget he'd even approached her. I'm not sure what you're saying, or trying to say. He took a step toward her and reached for her hand, cradling it in his. He had spent the last year and a half struggling through the divorce, trying his best to make sense of everything when his entire world flipped upside down. But standing there now in front of Brenna, with her warm blue eyes focused on him, he wanted her to know how much he regretted not saying the things he should have said, regretted walking away from her and leaving her behind. The last few days have reminded me of what the two of us once had, Wes started, trying to find the courage to say what he wanted to say next. He released a heavy breath as he ran a free hand through his hair. Why was it so hard to tell the one he cared about how he truly felt? She had been his best friend. He should be able to tell her everything. He should be able to spell it all out for her without worrying about how she might react now. Something he should have done all those years ago when she'd given him a sign that she wanted to be something more than just friends. Brenna's face twisted with confusion as she looked up from her hand in his and met his eyes with hers. That was years ago, Wes. A lot has changed since then. Her words sliced at him. If there was anything he hadn't expected her to say, that was it. I'm not sure what you're trying to. I'm trying to tell you I've always loved you, Wes interrupted, taking another step closer to her and closing what little distance they had between them. He heard the breath catch in her throat as she stood frozen in front of him. I never told you because I didn't want it to ruin the friendship we had, but now, I have nothing more to lose. Wes. His name was a whisper from her lips as she looked up at him with a pained expression on her face. There was no doubt she was trying to process what he'd just told her. The last thing he wanted was for her to push him away. Trust me, I know how long it's been, he whispered, keeping his attention on her and praying she wouldn't pull away. I just want what we used to have. I should have never second-guessed what we had between us. I should have listened when you tried telling me how you felt. I can't change that, no matter how much I regret it. But I'm here now, and I want what we had before I left. He traced a thumb along her jaw and waited for the other shoe to drop. He'd been completely open and honest with her. He felt vulnerable and foolish all in the same breath as he slowly tucked a wisp of blonde hair behind her ear. He leaned in, aching to kiss her and hear her say how much she loved him. She leaned in, meeting his gaze as she tilted her chin and relaxed in his arms. His lips were close enough to feel the warmth of her breath on them as someone rounded the corner and entered the classroom behind them. Brenna jumped back, releasing his hand and leaving him wishing away the interruption. Until he heard his daughter's voice. Dad, look what Mrs. Evers got for me, his little girl called out as she raced toward him, oblivious to what she had just interrupted. Wes looked from the melting ice cream cone in Kenzie's hand to Jane's innocent smile as she leaned against the classroom door frame. She said it's for helping her today. I told her I wanted to share it with you. Wes smiled down at his daughter as Jane explained, we saw Gertie at Chloe's bakery and she said we'd find you here. I'm sorry if we interrupted something. No, Brenna blurted out as she took another step away from Wes. You didn't interrupt anything. We were just talking about Kenzie while I was showing Wes the classroom. Wes's gaze landed on Brenna as she stammered over her words. She was flustered, and he wouldn't argue with how adorable it was to see her at a loss for words. Wes knelt down in front of Kenzie and wrapped his arms around her. What do you say we get back to the motel and finish that paper we started before we pack up and head to the stables? Yes. I want to see the horses that we'll be staying with, Kenzie said excitedly as she bounced on her heels. Can Miss Gibson come with us? Wes was about to tell his daughter that Brenna had other things to do when Brenna stepped toward them, offered Kenzie her hand, and said, I would love to. With that, Wes straightened and rested a hand on Kenzie's shoulder as they followed Jane out of the classroom and down the hallway toward the exit.
Chapter 10. Brenna allowed Kenzie to lead the way to the parking lot while thoughts of what just happened between her and Wes crossed her mind. She had almost kissed him. Had almost allowed thoughts of what might have been between them to start all over. A part of her wanted to believe it could be that easy, picking up right where they left off, but deep down, she knew it would be the complete opposite. She couldn't allow herself to fall in love with her best friend, especially now that she was his daughter's teacher. How would that look? How would Kenzie feel about it? She released Kenzie's hand and searched for her car keys. Wes stopped at the passenger side of his truck and gave her a funny look. "Why don't you ride with us? I can bring you back to your car once we're done at the ranch." Brenna paused for a minute as Kenzie took hold of her hand once again and pulled her toward Wes's truck. The thought of telling them she changed her mind, or that she forgot she had a meeting to attend, crossed her mind as she watched Jane drive out of the parking lot. Wes opened the passenger side door and lifted Kenzie into the truck, prompting her to scoot to the middle of the bench seat before turning back to Brenna. "Are you coming, Miss Gibson?" Kenzie asked as she patted the empty spot next to her. Brenna looked from Kenzie to Wes, who offered a small smile and a slight shrug of his shoulder before saying, "I think someone might be even more excited than I am to have you join us." Brenna relaxed as she gave a shy smile. "Of course." Wes offered a hand up as Brenna stepped into the truck. She grabbed the bottom of her sundress and tucked it out of the way as Wes closed the door with a smile. "I can't believe you still have this old thing," Brenna said as Wes climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. "I'm even more surprised it still runs after all these years." Wes shot a look over Kenzie's head and laughed. "You don't give it enough credit." "My dad stored it in his shop for a few years," Wes said with another slight laugh. "Until he realized I must have missed her more than I was letting on because he surprised me by bringing her to the city." Brenna ignored the slight pang of jealousy that jolted through her. "I'm sure you stuck out like a sore thumb." "Now that you mention it, I'm sure I did," Wes said with a light chuckle as he backed out of the parking spot and guided the old truck out of the parking lot, "but I can't say that I cared about that. The city life isn't all it's cracked up to be anyway." "Have you ever been to the stables, Miss Gibson?" Kenzie's question interrupted Wes's thoughts on what city life was like. Brenna hated to admit that she wanted to hear more about it as she answered the young girl's question. "I haven't." "Have you?" Kenzie shook her head as she finished the last of her ice cream cone. "Nope, but I can't wait to see the horses." "Do you like horses, Miss Gibson?" Brenna caught Wes's quick glance her way as she answered with a yes. She'd always enjoyed riding horses down by the river with Wes. She remembered the first time Wes surprised her with a late-night ride along Otter Creek. It had been the first time she'd ridden in a saddle. The first time she'd wrapped her arms around Wes, hanging on for dear life as he laughed while telling her to just relax. That everything would be okay and he wouldn't let anything happen to her. "And we're going to stay in a cabin?" Kenzie asked Wes as they drove toward the Silverleaf stables. "I've never been in a cabin." "Is it going to be huge?" Wes shot another look at Brenna before answering his daughter. Brenna could see the uncertainty in his eyes as he explained everything to his daughter. "I'm not sure about any of that, but I know that Dax is looking forward to having us at the ranch. I'm thankful that he's allowing us a place of our own." "What will I do while you're working?" Kenzie's question melted Brenna's heart. The little girl was trying her best to go with the flow of things, but she had so many questions for her father. "Will I be able to ride horses all day?" "Well, you start school next week," Wes explained, shooting a smile at Brenna as she focused on their conversation. "So I'm sure you and Miss Gibson will have a lot of fun while I'm working." Kenzie looked up at Brenna and asked, "Do you think we can take a field trip to the stables, Miss Gibson?" Brenna couldn't help but smile at the little girl's question. She'd taken some time meeting with the PTA and Noah to go over some ideas for field trips, but they had set nothing in stone yet. They were planning to meet one last time before the first week of school to get the ball rolling and everything lined up. "Maybe," Brenna answered, making a mental note to bring it up at the meeting. She wasn't sure how many of her students would enjoy seeing horses and spending the day at the stables, but she was more than willing to try it. "It might be a surprise if we do." I like surprises, Kenzie announced gleefully. Wes said, it wouldn't be a surprise, though, if you already know about it. Brenna watched as Kenzie processed what Wes had said. She smiled and nudged Kenzie. It'll be our little secret. I can keep a secret, Kenzie assured Brenna with a wide smile on her face. I won't even tell Ally. And she's my best friend. That'll be a tough thing to do, but I'll understand if you tell her, Brenna said as she looked at Wes. She'd shared everything with him, including the news from the doctor she'd received her junior year of high school. Being told she could never have children of her own had done a number on her, but Wes had been the one to assure her that everything would be okay. People proved doctors wrong all the time. Brenna shook the thought of never being a mother from her mind as Wes pulled into the parking area near the stables. Excitement filled the cab as Kenzie unbuckled her seatbelt and followed her father out of his side of the truck. Brenna unbuckled her belt as she watched Kenzie race her father to the passenger side of the truck and opened Brenna's door for her. Thank you, Brenna said as she smiled down at Kenzie. She accepted Wes's helping hand and slid out of the truck before straightening her dress. She looked down at her flip-flops and prayed she wouldn't regret wearing them. If she had known she would visit the stables, she would have worn something a little more secure, like the boots Wes had bought her after learning how to ride. I'll keep you safe, just watch where you're walking, Wes said with a light chuckle. I'm not sure how those will hold up when faced with a pile of. Dad, let's go, Kenzie interrupted, bouncing on her toes next to him before grabbing a hold of his hand. I want to see the horses. Well, first we have to find Dax and let him know we're here, Wes stated as he shared a laugh with Brenna over Kenzie's excitement. It had been years since she had been face to face with a horse. We'll have plenty of time to see the horses after we see our cabin. Kenzie seemed fine with that as she grabbed Wes's free hand, and it was only then that Brenna realized the two of them were still holding hands. She thought about dropping his hand, not wanting the attention it would bring, but she couldn't deny the sense of comfort it brought her. The familiarity of it all was something she'd been missing since her best friend left all those years ago.
Chapter 11. This is so awesome, Dad. Kenzie announced as Dax led them toward the secluded but cozy cabin. It was much larger inside and it appeared on the outside, and Wes thought the cabin was just right for the two of them. It might be in need of a woman's touch, Dax said, shooting a glance toward Brenna before settling his focus back on Wes. But I think it'll do for now. Wes nodded as he looked around. The cabin was furnished, meaning he didn't have to think about moving everything of theirs out of storage just yet. He would give it some time before settling in with their own belongings. It has more space than the motel room we've been staying in, Wes said as he shared a laugh with Dax. Thanks again, Dax. I owe you for this. Dax slapped a hand on Wes's shoulder and said, don't worry about it. Like I said, as long as you're working on the ranch, my place is your place. Dax turned his attention to Brenna, who was still holding onto Wes's hand. Wes caught the quick look Dax gave him with a raised brow but ignored it. Looks like the two of you have picked up right where you left off, Dax pointed out with a slight grin. Wes shot him a silent warning, telling him not to make a big deal about it. Dax nodded with a tip of his hat and said, I'll be out working with the horses if you need me. I'm looking forward to having you on the ranch. Can we see the horses? Kenzie asked as she raced down the stairs from the loft. Brenna released Wes's hand and took a step toward her, the fear of Kenzie falling evident on her face as she reached out for her at the bottom of the steps. I don't mind, as long as your father's okay with that, Dax said, exchanging a look with Wes as Brenna walked back with Kenzie's hand in hers. I've spent a lot of time with Zip. I think he'd be a good one to meet first. Zip? Kenzie raised a brow as she looked from Dax to Wes. Is that his name? Dax let out a short laugh but answered with a quick explanation. No, it's the shortened version of his name. He's a retired show horse, so he has one of those long names they give Appaloosas. Wow. Kenzie's fascination with the horse was all it took for Wes to know they'd found their home away from home. Does he do tricks? He can, Dax said, adjusting his cowboy hat on top of his head and settling in to answer more of Kenzie's questions. I'll have to show you what he can do when you meet him. Can we meet him now? Kenzie turned toward Wes and Brenna, placing her hands together as she begged them to say yes. Wes wanted to inspect the cabin, but decided he'd seen enough for now. There would be plenty of time to explore it once they brought what little they had over from the motel. Sure, if Dax is okay with that. Wes looked over at his friend, who was standing by the front door. Dax nodded once with a smile and motioned for them to follow him outside. "This is nice," Brenna whispered as she walked beside Wes. "I think you and Kenzie are going to like it here." "I know I would." Wes agreed with her but felt a knot form in his stomach as they walked down the front porch steps and followed Dax to the pasture full of horses. "There's no doubt that it's missing a woman's touch," Wes stated, shooting a look at Brenna. "Would you like to help me out with that?" Brenna looked up at him as she walked step for step next to him and, without missing a beat, she said, "I'd love to. I've always enjoyed decorating. I'm sure I can find some flowers downtown." "Whoa, flowers?" Wes said with a laugh. "I'm not sure about all of that." "Flowers are pretty, Dad," Kenzie called out over her shoulder, causing Wes to shake his head. For being little, that child of his had big ears. "It looks like I'm outnumbered here," Wes admitted, conceding defeat. "Maybe flowers won't be so bad after all." "I'll see if I can find a porch sign that would go along with the flowers," Brenna said. From the look on her face, Wes could tell she was enjoying the thought of helping him make the cabin a home. "Maybe Kenzie and I can look around town and see what we can find while you get things situated here at the ranch. Do you think she'd like that?" Wes knew his daughter would enjoy spending time with Brenna. Kenzie adored her new teacher, and he wouldn't argue with the relief he felt knowing the two of them were bonding. "I think she would. She doesn't get to shop much anymore." The statement caused his heart to sink at the realization that losing Nicole had taken different things from Kenzie than it had from him, but he hadn't realized the little things that were important for his daughter. He had tried to make things as normal as he could, but a mother's touch in life was something he couldn't replace. "That's okay," Brenna said with a slight nudge in his arm. She looked up at him with understanding and a sympathetic smile. "I have no problem with girl dates and shopping." "Dad, look," Kenzie called out from the fence line. Wes and Brenna approached the wooden fence and stood behind Kenzie as she stepped onto the bottom board, anchoring herself to get a better look at the horse. Dax leaned on the fence next to them as he told them about the horse and how he'd found his way to the stables. The horse, a black Appaloosa with a blanket of white and dark spots, came to greet them when Dax whistled. Brenna's eyes lit up as he got closer. "He's beautiful," she whispered as she left Wes's side and reached out to pet the horse. Her love of horses matched his, and it was good to see it hadn't faded over the years. He wondered if Brenna would be up for a ride with him and Kenzie sometime. "His markings are incredible. He's definitely one of a kind," Dax noted. "If you'd like to ride him, I can grab his saddle." Brenna and Kenzie looked back at Wes, questioning if he was okay with it, and he offered a laid-back shrug. "As long as you wear a helmet, Kenz." Dax patted the horse's side and said, "I'm sure there's one hanging around that'll fit her. I'll go to the barn and see what I can find." "Want me to come along with you?" Wes offered, knowing Brenna and Kenzie would be okay with spending time with Zip while he helped Dax round up saddles and helmets. He turned to Brenna and asked, "Are you two okay with me heading to the barn with Dax?" "Of course," Brenna said, smiling down at Kenzie. "I'm sure we'll still be right here when you get back." "Uh-huh," Kenzie said with a nod as she ran a hand through the horse's mane. "Okay, but you listen to Miss Gibson and stay on this side of the fence," Wes said before placing a kiss on his daughter's cheek. He turned to Brenna, holding back the desire to kiss her, and said, "I'll be right back." She smiled as Wes turned to walk off with Dax. Dax nudged Wes's arm on the way to the barn as he looked over his shoulder. Once they were in the clear of Brenna overhearing, Dax said, "I thought you said you weren't interested in starting a relationship with anyone." "Brenna isn't just anyone," Wes said, a little too defensive. Dax stopped in his tracks and studied Wes for a minute before saying, "I think we all knew that long before you did. Or at least, I should say Grandma Gertie did." "What's that supposed to mean?" Dax shook his head as he continued walking toward the barn. Wes followed Dax into the barn and gathered the helmets off a nearby hook. He already knew what it meant. Gertie had high hopes of meddling in everyone's business while playing matchmaker. She'd pegged Wes and Brenna a time or two throughout the years, and if he hadn't let his fear of ruining a good friendship get in the way, Gertie's wishes would have been granted. We were best friends. I would not chance wrecking that. Dax offered a quick shrug before tossing a saddle over his shoulder. Just sayin'. Things might have been a little different if you hadn't run off with Nicole. His friend's words stung, but Wes held it together. He wouldn't argue that things would have been different. He'd known that all along. But he wouldn't regret doing what he'd done, because if he hadn't, he wouldn't have Kenzie. That alone made it all worth it. You know what they say about successful relationships, right? Dax said as he handed another saddle to Wes. It's all about falling in love with your best friend. Wes took the saddle from Dax and gave him a quick shove. Cut it out, he warned, even though what his friend said made sense. Let's talk about you and Chloe. Surprised, Dax took a step back and shook his head. That's my best friend's little sister, man. There's a difference. Whatever you say, man. Wes shrugged and kept his thoughts to himself. Whether or not Dax liked it, everyone could see how Dax felt about Chloe from day one. They all hung out together throughout the years, and there was something between the two of them, regardless of the fact she was Justin's little sister. Yay! They found the saddles. Kenzie called out as she climbed down from the fence and raced toward Wes and Dax. Brenna trailed close behind Kenzie, keeping her attention on Wes. We get to ride the horses, Miss Gibson. I can't wait, Brenna said with a smile. It's been a while since the last time I was in the saddle. I should run home and change. Just kick those flip-flops off and you'll be just fine, Wes said as he looked down at her feet. There was no way she could wear those as they rode, and he would not waste any more time getting in the saddle with her and his little girl. As they saddled Zip and another one of Dax's tame horses, Wes shook off the thoughts his conversation with Dax had brought on as he focused on Brenna. Maybe Dax was right. Maybe this was his second chance to get things right without the fear of messing them up.
Chapter 12. With Kenzie securely in the saddle with Dax, Brenna climbed onto the saddle behind Wes. She wrapped her arms around his waist and relaxed against him as they headed out of the pasture toward the surrounding treeline that shaded Otter Creek. The midday sun spread its warmth on Brenna's bare shoulders as she breathed in the fresh mountain air. There was so much to be thankful for in life, and being able to ride with her best friend and his little girl was at the top of the list. It looks like Kenzie's enjoying this more than I am, Brenna said, tapping Wes on the shoulder while watching Kenzie take a hold of the reins with Dax. I think she's going to love it here at the ranch. That's what I'm hoping, Wes said with a smile. She's a good kid. I just want to give her the best life that I can. Brenna heard the doubt in his voice. She couldn't imagine how difficult things had been for Wes, but if there was one thing she knew, it was the fact that Wes was already doing the best he could with his little girl. You already are, Brenna whispered softly, praying that her words would take away the doubt he was feeling. She's proof that you're doing everything right. Wes let out a subtle grunt before saying, I don't know about that. It's been hard to tell if I'm doing what's right at all. His words were filled with uncertainty and doubt. Brenna wanted to take it all away from him and show him that, because of him, Kenzie had everything she needed. Starting over is a lot harder than I thought it would be, Wes said, interrupting the silence between them as he guided the horse down by the water. They followed closely behind Dax and Kenzie, keeping a short distance between them. But it'll be a little easier now that you have us, Brenna stated with confidence. She couldn't imagine how difficult it was for him to raise Kenzie alone, but he wasn't alone anymore. You know what they say about it taking a village. Well, Silverleaf Falls is your village. You have plenty of people here who are more than willing to help you and Kenzie. I've been thanking God for that every day, Wes said as he guided the horse along the bank of the river. Dax and Kenzie were crossing the river and slowly making their way to the other side as Wes led their horse into the water behind them. I'm just glad that Kenzie and I have people like you in our lives. You make each day a little easier than the day before just knowing that you're here for us, Isn't that what best friends are for? Brenna asked, playfully as Wes tossed her a look over his shoulder. Everything's going to be okay. Isn't that what you've always said to me? Because it was true, Wes said, pulling the reins and stopping next to Dax and Kenzie. Before Brenna said anything else, Kenzie slid off the horse with Dax's help and ran toward Wes and Brenna. Slow it down, Kenz. You can't approach a horse like that. Kenzie stopped in her tracks and ducked her head. Her bottom lip jutted out and trembled as she fought back the tears welling in her eyes. Wes had been a bit too harsh with his tone, but Brenna knew he wanted to protect Kenzie from getting hurt. Brenna climbed down from the saddle, releasing her hold from Wes as soon as her feet touched the ground. She made her way over to Kenzie and knelt down in front of her. Hey, don't cry. It's okay. Your dad just doesn't want you to get hurt, Brenna explained, tossing a look at Wes, who was now making his way over to them. Sometimes we get excited and we don't think about the dangers that surround us. We have to be careful not to spook the horses, okay? Kenzie nodded as she swiped at her tears. She looked up at Wes with tear-filled eyes and apologized. It broke Brenna's heart to see the little girl in tears, but she was glad it turned out to be a teachable moment. It's okay, Kenz, Wes said, squatting down next to Brenna in front of Kenzie. I didn't mean to scare you. I just didn't want you to get hurt. Like Miss Gibson said, we have to take it slow when we approach the horses, okay? Kenzie nodded with a slight sniffle as she wiped more fallen tears with the back of her hand. Can we go home now? Brenna's heart broke. The ride was supposed to be fun, and it had been. There was so much the little girl had yet to learn about horses, but Brenna knew spending time on the ranch with Wes and Dax would help her understand things a little better. But right now, she'd had enough. Brenna wrapped her arms around Kenzie and hugged her tightly against her chest. She didn't enjoy seeing kids cry. What do you say we ride back to the stables and see if we can find something else to do? Kenzie's eyes lit up with excitement, and Brenna couldn't help but feel excited as well. She wasn't too sure what they would do, or why she volunteered to stick around, but there was a part of her that didn't want to leave just yet.
Chapter 13. He hadn't meant to scare his daughter, but the thought of her getting hurt scared him. Thankfully, Brenna had been there to comfort his daughter and could explain things a little better to Kenzie. He'd watched the interaction between Brenna and Kenzie unfold and felt an overwhelming regret burrow in his stomach. Nicole had always been the one with a softer approach. She took time to explain when Kenzie had done something wrong. Not Wes. He was quick to react out of fear, but he was working on that. What do you say we head into town and grab some stuff for Esmores? Wes asked, looking from Brenna to Kenzie. He couldn't help wondering how long Brenna would stick around. The sun was setting just beyond the trees, casting a lavender and honey-colored sky as a backdrop to the already beautiful scenery. If there was one thing he missed the most when he moved to the city, aside from those he cared about, it had been the wide-open space of small-town Vermont. I can take you back to your car if you'd like. He prayed she'd say no. He was enjoying the time they were spending together, and he would be lying if he said he was ready for the day to end. Are you going back to the motel for Esmores or coming back here? Brenna's question caught him off guard and made him think about an answer. If he were to say the motel, would she change her mind and head home for the evening? Where would you like to have them? A soft smile spread across her face as her cheeks turned a light shade of pink. Anywhere with you and Kenzie is fine with me. There was something about the way she said it that made him realize how much he missed her. He couldn't remember a time when they were growing up that she didn't want to spend time with him. It was good to know that hadn't changed. Well then, in that case, he said, heading toward his truck and opening the passenger door for Brenna and Kenzie, I say we let Kenzie decide. His little girl's eyes lit up as he lifted her into the truck. I want to stay the night in the cabin. Can we, Dad? I don't see why not, Wes said, offering a hand up for Brenna. She climbed into the cab of his truck and smiled back at him. We'll just swing by the motel and grab our things before we head into town. He turned to Brenna and asked, would you like me to drop you off at your car and have you meet us back out here? He didn't want to take a chance of having Kenzie fall asleep while they were enjoying the campfire and not be able to bring Brenna back into town. "I'm okay with that," Brenna said as Kenzie cheered for Esmores and more time with her teacher. "I don't want to miss out on having Esmores with my two favorite people." Wes nodded and shut the door before making his way around to the driver's side. He climbed in and fired up the old reliable truck and shifted into drive before heading into town. The warmth of the fire chased off the late evening chill. Wes helped Kenzie roast her marshmallows over the flame and let her smash them between the layer of chocolate and graham cracker. He settled into his spot next to the fire as Brenna finished making a s'more for them. "It doesn't get much better than this," he said, accepting the s'more and thanking her. "I like it out here, Dad," Kenzie said as she took a bite of her chocolatey treat. A string of marshmallow hung midair as she pulled the s'more away from her mouth. A fit of giggles escaped as it landed against her chin, and she struggled to remove the sticky chunk from underneath her bottom lip. "Miss Gibson," Kenzie said, still struggling with the stickiness now clustered between her fingers. "You have chocolate on your cheek." Kenzie lost it in another fit of laughter as Wes reached over and swiped the melted chocolate from Brenna's face. Brenna tipped her head back laughing as she asked, "How in the world did it end up there?" Wes shrugged with a slight grin, and Kenzie said, "They are really messy." Kenzie's nose crinkled as she pried her fingers free of melted marshmallow. She held her hand up in front of them before trying her best to lick it off her fingers. "But they're so good. It's so beautiful out here," Brenna said as she finished her s'more. Wes offered to make her another, but she refused with a quick shake of her head. "Do you remember all those nights we would lie out underneath the stars?" How could he forget? It had been a weekly thing he looked forward to when Brenna and their group of friends gathered around under the stars and talked about their plans for the future. There had been quite a few times they'd made wishes on the same falling star. "Things seemed so simple back then," Wes said, recalling his memories of those nights and how uncomplicated life had been. "If only we knew then what we know now." He glanced over at Kenzie, realizing how silent she had gotten. She was now curled up in her favorite blanket with her Elsa doll tucked underneath her chin. He was envious of how fast his daughter could fall asleep. "I don't know," Brenna said, "I like to think that everything works out in the end. What's meant to be, will be." "I can only hope you're right. At least for Kenzie's sake anyway," Wes said as he watched his daughter sleep. He'd felt defeated when Nicole served him with divorce papers. He'd tried to keep his family together for his daughter's sake, but despite his efforts, Nicole hadn't been happy and wanted out. It had nearly killed him when she told him she was better off alone, without Kenzie or anyone holding her back. He'd spent nights wondering where things went wrong and praying for God to provide him with the guidance and strength he needed to get through the divorce while taking care of Kenzie alone. Brenna's hand rested on top of his. He turned his attention from his daughter and focused on Brenna. "Everything's going to be okay, Wes. Kenzie's a smart girl. She might not understand everything now, but one day she will, and she'll be thankful that you were and will always be here for her." "I've been struggling with how difficult the conversation was when I had to tell her that her mother left and wasn't coming back for her," Wes said. A feeling of defeat blended with the guilt in the pit of his stomach as he thought about what that would do to Kenzie. "I feel like maybe I could have done it better somehow." She hasn't asked lately, but when Nicole first left, Kenzie asked quite often. "What did you tell her when she asks?" Brenna asked quietly as a concerned look crossed her face. "I tell her what I can to comfort her, and I just pray that one day she'll understand." If only praying alone could help him, he wouldn't have to struggle through it. Wes glanced over at his sleeping daughter and back to Brenna. "I should take her inside and get her tucked in," Wes said as he released Brenna's hand and stood up from his chair. Though, honestly, he didn't want to chance his little girl waking up and overhearing their conversation. Brenna stood from her chair after glancing at her watch. "It's getting late. I should get going." Wes hated the thought of their night together ending so soon, but it was probably best for them to call it a night before it got any later. "Let me tuck her in and I'll be right back," Wes said. Brenna nodded with a smile as he lifted his daughter into his arms. "I'll wait right here." Wes carried his daughter into the cabin and carefully set her down on the sofa bed. She would eventually have her own bed once they got settled at the cabin, but for now, they would sleep in the living room. He straightened the blanket and tucked it in underneath his little girl the best he could without waking her. He placed a kiss on her forehead and silently prayed that Brenna was right about Kenzie being okay. A light knock at the door startled him as he took a step away from the couch. Brenna held up the Elsa doll with a soft smile. "You dropped it on your way inside. I figured I'd bring it just in case she wakes up looking for it." "Thank you," he said as he took the doll and tucked it in next to his daughter. He made his way to the door and looked back at his sleeping beauty. "She won't go a night without that thing." Brenna smiled next to him as they watched Kenzie sleep. "I was like that, too. I think a lot of girls have that one special doll they sleep with every night." Wes nodded, knowing the doll provided a sense of security and comfort to Kenzie. A sense that he couldn't always provide her with. Brenna turned at the door and motioned for him to follow her back outside. "I enjoyed tonight," Brenna said as they stepped onto the front porch. "I needed a day away from getting things ready for school to start. I feel like I spent the entire summer waiting for the first day of school, but now I'm nowhere close to being ready." "You still have a few days, and I'm here if you need my help with anything," he offered, even though he wasn't sure what all he could do to help. He didn't know a thing about teaching, let alone what all went into setting things up for the school year. Brenna accepted his offer with a quick nod before saying, "I might take you up on that. Especially with the festival coming up this weekend." "Festival?" Wes said with a light chuckle. "This town and their festivals. It's more like an ice cream social than anything. They've always held one for the end of summer," Brenna stated as she looked up at him. "It's one last hurrah before school starts and a way for kids to celebrate the end of the summer. They'll find any reason to have a festival, won't they? Don't you remember all the festivals and gatherings we had while growing up?" "Nothing has changed since we were kids," Brenna said before quickly adding, "but, truthfully, I like it. It's a chance to relive my childhood days while spending time with the people I care about the most." She wasn't wrong. Wes had enjoyed the festivals while growing up. The small town had gone above and beyond to provide the townspeople with opportunities to create memories that would last a lifetime. "And now Kenzie has time to experience it while making memories here with you," Brenna said with a proud smile. "That's something to look forward to, isn't it?" "It is," he said with a wide smile as he thought back to his childhood years. The festivals held on the village green were something the entire town looked forward to, and he couldn't wait for Kenzie to experience the interconnectedness of Silver Leaf Falls. "I'm going to talk to the PTA and Noah about a new idea for the reading program this year," Brenna said, changing the subject and focusing on work again. Wes respected her dedication as a teacher. "Kenzie mentioned a field trip here for the class to see the horses, but I want to make sure they get their reading done, too." Wes nodded along as Brenna told him about her idea revolving around reading minutes and earning the field trip. He liked the idea. It sounded like a good way to entice the children to read while knowing they would get a day out of the classroom. It wasn't too long ago that Noah did something similar by encouraging them to read, she explained. Except for the fact that he ended up spending the night on the school's rooftop. It was a successful way to get the children involved with reading. "Sounds like Kenzie will have an eventful year to look forward to," Wes said with a smile. He couldn't help but feel content with his decision to move back to Silver Leaf Falls. "I should let you get going. Otherwise, we could stand here all night." Brenna's eyes lit up as she offered him a knowing smile. He would do anything to spend more time with her, but she had other things to focus on, aside from him and Kenzie. "I'll see you Saturday," he asked confidently as he stepped toward her. He wrapped his arms around her and held her close to him as she nodded. "Maybe we can meet later at night for the movie on the green." "Sounds like a date," Brenna said as she looked up at him. The smile on her face told him the thought of them together made her happy. He wouldn't deny the thought made him happy as well. Reconnecting with Brenna seemed to make all of his troubles disappear. "It's a date then," Wes said with a slight grin as he tucked a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear. He trailed his finger to her chin and lifted it as he leaned in. His heart danced wildly inside of his chest as she leaned in to meet him halfway. Without hesitation, he closed the distance between them, feeling the warmth of her breath on his lips as he kissed her. There weren't enough stars in the sky to wish for a better night than tonight. He had everything he ever needed right there in Silver Leaf Falls. Nothing could take that away from him now that he was back home.
Chapter 14. The kiss had been everything she'd ever thought it would be, and more. All those years she had spent dreaming about what it would be like falling in love and kissing her best friend were nothing compared to the real-life experience. She floated mindlessly through the day, absorbing little from the meeting she had with the PTA and Noah night while enjoying a delicious lunch at Sizzle and Sip. As far as she could tell, they were on board with her plan to visit Silver Leaf Stables, but had asked her to hold off until late spring instead of late fall in order to give them plenty of time to gather parental consent while the children earned enough points. They wanted to make sure every student earned the field trip, and Brenna was right there with them on that. She wouldn't want any of her students left behind. Everything was falling into place and held a hopeful promise for the future. The ice cream social was about to start when Brenna carried a large box of ice cream cones over to the booth being run by Chloe and set them down next to her. This should do it. The green was filled with attractions and several booths with fun activities for kids of all ages to enjoy. Saturdays were the perfect days to host events, and the weather was just right, not too hot for a summer day. So I heard from a certain someone that you might have spent quite some time out at the stables the other night, Chloe said with a teasing grin. I mean, I can't blame you if you did. Brenna offered a half laugh with a quick shake of her head. Leave it to Grandma Gertie to get the rumors started. I have no regrets. I enjoyed a nice trail ride and s'mores. Not to mention the kiss. She wouldn't mention that part, not yet, anyway. Sounds like an eventful evening, Chloe said, twisting the cone just right under the ice cream machine before handing it off to Brenna to add the sprinkles on top for their first customer, Noah Knight. It's good to see you both here today, Noah stated as he accepted his ice cream with a smile. I'm sure it will keep the two of you busy for most of the afternoon. That's what we're hoping for, Brenna admitted with a smile. Before walking away, Noah turned back and said, Don't be surprised if I come back for seconds. But next time I will bring Liz with me. Sounds good, Chloe said with a soft laugh. She turned to Brenna and said, Okay, now tell me more. Brenna grabbed another cone from Chloe and sprinkled it with assorted candies before handing it off to the next in line. There really wasn't time to talk now that a line had formed in the last few minutes, but Brenna knew her friend wouldn't let it go until she had details from the evening Brenna had spent with Wes and Kenzie. There's nothing more to tell you, Brenna stated as she tried her best to focus on the task at hand. Several kids lined up in front of them, waiting for their ice cream. Lies, Chloe mumbled with a playful eye roll as she handed another ice cream cone to Brenna. Noah hadn't been lying when he'd said they would be busy. They hadn't been serving for 20 minutes and had already sold over 15 cones. Come on, her friend begged as soon as there was a gap in the line. I've been waiting years for this, Bren. Brenna let out a light-hearted chuckle. So have I. Chloe tossed her hair up into a messy bun and said, Then spill it. What happened? Brenna thought about the evening she'd spent with Wes and Kenzie. It had been the perfect day leading into the evening, and it felt a little too good to be true. It almost felt as though Wes and Kenzie were home to her, a family. There might have been a kiss, Brenna admitted sheepishly, feeling the heat creep into her cheeks as Chloe's jaw dropped in shock. I knew it, Chloe said. Pointing a finger at Brenna, she said, And you weren't planning on telling me, were you? Brenna offered a subtle shrug and was about to answer when Kenzie barreled toward the booth, calling out for her. Miss Gibson. I want to hear about that kiss before the day is over, Chloe whispered with a wink as Kenzie approached the booth. Brenna leaned on the counter of the booth and smiled down at the little girl who had stolen her heart. Hi, Kenzie. What would you like? Kenzie glanced over her shoulder in search of Wes, who was walking up behind her. Dad and I would like an ice cream with all the sprinkles. Brenna shot a look at Wes, who offered a subtle shrug and nodded. Okay, coming right up. I finished the paper you gave me, Miss Gibson, Kenzie announced proudly. Me and Dad worked on it together this morning. Dad and I, Kenz, Wes corrected. He looked up at Brenna and said, "She's been trying to work on it for the last few days. She finally got me to sit down and help her with it." Kenzie nodded proudly as she reached up for her finished cone. "It's all about me, but I included some things about Dad, too." Brenna shot a look at Wes, who once again offered a subtle shrug. "What can I say? My daughter loves me." "How are you liking it on the ranch, Wes?" Chloe asked, leaning on the counter next to Brenna. "I hear Dax can't wait to get you started with work." Brenna caught the way her friend's tone changed when she mentioned Dax. Chloe had had a crush on him far longer than she let on, but Brenna knew the truth. She'd been crushing on her brother's best friend for years now. "I start on Tuesday," Wes confirmed. He let out a light chuckle and said, "Not to forget that it saves Dax from having to give me holiday pay." They shared a laugh as Kenzie pointed a finger at her chest and said, "That's when I start school, too. Dad says we'll both start something new on Tuesday together." Brenna's heart melted at the thought of Kenzie wanting to be just like her father. The two of them were like two peas in a pod, and Brenna loved that about them. "I'm sure you both will do just fine," Chloe said. She nudged Brenna with an elbow and said, "You've got one of the best teachers, Kenz." Chloe looked at Wes and said, "Dax is pretty great, too." Brenna noticed the light shade of pink filling Chloe's cheeks the minute she'd said it and couldn't help but laugh. "So I've heard." Wes and Kenzie ate their ice cream while conversing about the day's events. No sooner had Kenzie wished her best friend was there than Ally ran their way from across the street. Steph, and who Brenna assumed to be Ally's little sister, weren't too far behind. "Let's go play the games," Kenzie said, motioning for her friend to follow her. Ally looked at Brenna and back to Kenzie. "Maybe Ally would like an ice cream cone," Brenna said with a smile as she prompted Chloe to make each of Steph's girls one before adding sprinkles and handing them off to Ally and her little sister. "Have fun," she called after them. "Would you like an ice cream cone, Steph?" Chloe asked, ready to make one for their friend. "I won't ever say no to ice cream," Steph admitted, sharing a laugh among friends. Chloe twisted a perfect cone for Steph and handed it off to Brenna to do her thing with sprinkles before asking, "Would you mind looking after the booth with me so these two lovebirds can venture off somewhere more private?" Steph exchanged a glance with Wes and Brenna, putting the pieces together before an excited expression crossed her face. "Of course." Brenna tried to tell them it was fine. She was fine right where she was. Wes wanted to spend time with Kenzie. She needed to let them enjoy their time together. But of course, her friends weren't taking no for an answer as they playfully shoved her out of the booth and guided her toward Wes. Heat flushed Brenna's face as she looked up at Wes. He was busy eating his ice cream while pretending not to have noticed the surrounding commotion. "Friends," she said with a heavy sigh as she matched Wes step for step toward the activities. "But it gives you time with me," Wes said with a wink as he finished his ice cream. "Besides, what are friends for if they aren't encouraging a healthy relationship?" "True," Brenna said, knowing she couldn't argue with that. As they came to a stop next to an old oak tree, Wes turned toward her and looked down at her hands. "You didn't grab yourself an ice cream cone?" Brenna hadn't thought about grabbing herself one before being shoved out of the booth. "No, but it's fine. I'll grab one later." Wes looked over his shoulder and back at her. "Come on," he said, taking hold of her hand and leading her back to the booth. "You don't come to an ice cream social and not get ice cream." Brenna laughed as she allowed him to pull her back to the booth they'd walked away from less than 10 minutes ago. She would have been fine without an ice cream cone, but Wes had a point. She shouldn't pass up the opportunity to enjoy a cool treat on a warm summer day. She watched as Steph added sprinkles to the top of her ice cream like a pro and accepted it with a quick "thank you" before turning back to join Wes. She didn't give her friends any time to say anything about the two of them before walking off in the opposite direction. Even though she knew without a doubt they were talking amongst themselves and carrying on about Brenna's relationship status with her best friend. Brenna walked with Wes around the green, taking in the excitement surrounding them and enjoying her time. Tuesday was the big day, and she finally felt ready to get started. She couldn't wait to see her students and get back to doing the things she loved the most. What do you say we head over there and let me try to win you something? Wes asked, pointing at a lonely booth with a variety of stuffed animals lining the awning. It'll be just like the old days. Brenna couldn't say no. Reliving moments from her past was something she looked forward to. Moments like this with Wes were something she had always enjoyed. Wes stepped up to the booth and offered the man a $5 bill for 4 darts. The man placed the darts on the table in front of Wes. Brenna watched in silence as Wes took his time and aimed for each balloon. He popped 3 of the 4 and glanced down at her. 3 out of 4 isn't bad, but I can do better, he said as he held out another $5 bill to the vendor and accepted his next round of darts. I'm going to win something big for both you and Kenzie. Just wait and see. No sooner had the 4th balloon popped, and the vendor told Wes what his prizes were, than Wes turned to Brenna and lifted her into his muscular arms, spinning her around before setting her back down. Brenna couldn't believe he'd won 2 large stuffed animals, giving her first choice of what she wanted. I think Kenzie would love this one, Wes said, as the vendor handed Brenna's stuffed panda over to her. She looked up at the one Wes had picked out for Kenzie and agreed with his choice. The rainbow-colored unicorn was the perfect choice for Kenzie. She shined just as vibrantly as that unicorn, and Brenna knew the young girl would fall in love with it the minute she saw it. Brenna hugged her bear tightly as Wes placed a kiss on her forehead. This day can't get any better than this, Brenna said with a contented smile. But before she could say anything more to Wes, or even thank him, she caught sight of a woman she recognized walking their way at the same time. Kenzie hollered out, "Mom!"
Chapter 15. Wes barely had time to realize what was happening by the time Kenzie ran up to Nicole and wrapped her arms around her mother's waist. He had enough time to witness Brenna's smile plummet to a heartfelt frown before Kenzie called out for him to look at who she found. "I'll catch up with you later," Brenna said quietly before giving him a chance to recover. He wanted her to stay by his side, but he couldn't get the words out as he watched her walk off toward the ice cream booth to join her friends. "Hi," Nicole said, walking hand in hand with Kenzie as they approached him. Wes wanted to ask her what she was doing there. To ask why she had come all this way to make a scene after deciding to walk away from what they had. "Hi." He bit his tongue and kept the interaction polite for Kenzie's sake. At least until he knew why Nicole was there. "I figured I would find you here," Nicole said with an innocent smile. Not that she was blameless by any means. It killed Wes to realize that the woman he'd once shared a life with could walk away and waltz back into it like nothing ever happened. "You've always loved this small town." He kept silent as she glanced around, watching as she focused on the booth that housed Brenna and her friends. "I can see some things haven't changed over the years." He offered a low grunt in response to her obvious assumption, wanting nothing more than to ask her to leave. She had no business there, not to mention what seeing her would do to Kenzie. The two of them had managed just fine over the last year without Nicole in their lives. He didn't need her waltzing back in and causing a disturbance in dealing with her absence. "Mom, look what Dad got me," Kenzie said, holding up the rainbow-colored unicorn and showing it off. "I'm going to name her Sparkles." Nicole smiled down at their daughter and said, "I like that name, honey." Wes bit his tongue as he listened to Nicole exchange pleasantries with their daughter. She could try to play the role of Mother of the Year, but he could see right through her antics. She wasn't there to make nice. There was no doubt in his mind that she was there with an agenda a mile wide, wider than the small town he'd retreated to in search of security and comfort while raising his daughter alone. Alone. Like Nicole had wanted to be. "Can we go somewhere a little more private?" Nicole asked, glancing around at the gathering crowd. "Kenzie, would you like to play with Ally for a few minutes, so your mother and I can talk?" Kenzie looked from Wes to Nicole before clinging to her mother's leg. Wes knelt down in front of her, knowing she didn't want to let go out of fear of not seeing Nicole again. He couldn't blame her, but right now, he needed to talk to Nicole and see what she was doing there without little ears hearing the conversation. Kenzie looked up at Nicole after debating on following through with her father's plea and handed Sparkles to her. "Will you hold her for me so I can play?" Wes shifted his weight once Kenzie ran off to play and refocused his attention on Nicole. "Whatever you've come here to say, you can say it here. She seemed not to like his answer, but he wasn't willing to go anywhere with her and leave his daughter unattended. He glanced over at Brenna, who was now busying herself with making ice cream cones and offering them to a long line of adults and children. It didn't take long for the two of you to pick up right where you left off, Nicole said with a half smile. A smile so fake, Wes could see right through it. What do you want, Nicole? He asked, not giving her time for pleasantries or small talk. What are you doing here? Nicole pulled her attention away from Brenna and the ice cream booth and focused on him. He didn't care what she thought about him and Brenna. She had no business concerning herself with the life he was choosing to give their daughter. Well, she said, scanning the area once again before continuing, since you don't want to talk in a more private area, I guess I'll just say it here. He crossed his arms over his chest, waiting for her to get on with whatever she had to tell him. He wanted to get back to enjoying the day, if that was even a possibility now that Nicole had potentially killed the vibe. I want you and Kenzie to come back to Burlington with me. Nicole said it with as much ease as she had the day she told him she wanted out of the marriage, and away from him and Kenzie. He shook his head in frustration. That's not going to happen. Why not? Nicole asked, a look of disappointment crossing her face as he studied her, trying to figure out if she was serious or not. Because I've been there and done that, Nicole, remember? Wes stared at her, waiting for her to admit it. You're the one who wanted out. You're the one who walked away and left us. His words trailed off as he held back his frustration. He would not allow her to have an effect on him. Not like this. Not when he and Kenzie had come so far and had made a life for themselves without Nicole. I was wrong for doing that, Nicole started, reaching out for him and looking shocked when he jerked away from her. He narrowed his eyes at her, warning her to keep her distance. I'm sorry, I did that. But I realize now that I shouldn't have left. I shouldn't have said the things I said. I didn't mean it. Wes shook his head, refusing to believe anything she had to say. It's a little too late for that, don't you think? Nicole took a step back as though his words had slapped her. He felt no remorse for telling her how it was. He had no interest in trying to rekindle their relationship. She'd put him through the ringer, and not to mention everything she'd put Kenzie through, countless nights of crying herself to sleep while Wes held her against his chest and promised that everything would be okay. I want my family back, Nicole pleaded with a slight pout. Tears filled her eyes, making it hard for Wes to tell if this was all for show or if it was real. Regardless, he wouldn't fall for her antics. Please, Wes. Please let me have you and Kenzie back in my life. No, Wes said, putting his foot down. It's not going to happen. We're not getting back together. If you want Kenzie in your life, then you can. I'm not going to stop you from seeing her. You're important to her. But you can't say you'll be there and not show up. That isn't fair to Kenzie. Nicole's jaw dropped in disbelief. His words were harsh, he knew that, but he wanted to get his point across to her. She wasn't listening. She needed to realize that he would not put Kenzie through all of that again just so Nicole could change her mind in a week or two when things weren't going her way. Wes reached out for Sparkles and placed the stuffed animal in the crook of his arm. He turned to walk away, but stopped before attempting one last time to set her straight. Go back to the city and live the life you've always wanted without having to worry about me and Kenzie. We're fine right where we are, and nothing's going to change that. He didn't care what happened next. The only thing he cared about was finding his daughter and heading home. He didn't want to make a scene, at least not a bigger one than the one they just caused. Once they were home, he would explain everything to Kenzie while praying she would understand. She needed to know the truth about her mother. He had put off telling her long enough while praying for a better way to explain. Seeing Nicole had shot a wave of uncertainty through him. The thought of her wanting Kenzie back in her life was unsettling. He couldn't risk losing Kenzie over someone who didn't love her like he did. To someone who wouldn't bat an eye at breaking his little girl's heart. Are you ready to go home, Kenz? He asked, trying his best to stay calm as he rounded up his daughter and her things. But we just got here, she whined as she looked over at Ally. Can't I just stay a little longer? We should really get back home and get things rearranged, he said, silently pleading for his daughter to give in and just go with him. We can show Sparkles your new room and introduce her to the rest of your friends at home. But what about Mom? Kenzie asked, glancing back over her shoulder in search of the woman who had turned their world upside down. And Miss Gibson? Doesn't she want to come with us? Wes's heart staggered at the mention of Brenna. He wanted nothing more than to find Brenna and talk to her. To tell her she had nothing to worry about. He'd seen the look on her face when Nicole approached them. We'll meet up with her later at the movie, okay? Kenzie agreed to leave the green and climb into his truck. He searched for Brenna among the crowd, but she was nowhere to be found. The last time he'd seen her, she'd been busy handing out ice cream cones. He felt bad for leaving without talking to her, but he would talk to her later.
Chapter 16. Brenna watched the interaction between Wes and Nicole play out. It hadn't taken long for Nicole to walk back to her car and leave. A knot the size of Vermont filled Brenna's stomach at the thought of what Nicole's visit might mean for Wes and Kenzie's future in Silverleaf Falls, for Brenna's future. She felt a little foolish for considering what having Nicole back in Wes's life would mean for her. Especially when Kenzie could have her mother back in hers. Brenna wouldn't stand in the way of that. She knew better than to include herself somewhere she didn't belong. It broke her heart to think about the memories they'd shared over the last several days, and to think that it had all been too good to be true, a feeling she'd felt all along. But she'd seen the way Kenzie's face lit up when she'd seen her mother walking their way. She'd seen the way the young girl had forgiven her mother's absence, without a second thought. After the commotion Brenna had witnessed, she snuck away from the booth and ventured over to Sizzle and Sip for a late afternoon coffee and a bite to eat. Both Steph and Chloe assured her they could handle it for the rest of the afternoon while telling her to take her time. It was obvious they both felt bad for what transpired on the green with the heaviness of uncertainty clinging in the air. She slid into the booth across from Gertie and let out a deep sigh. "What's on your mind, dear?" Gertie asked, a look of concern creasing her brow. "If it is what I think it is, you have nothing to worry about," Gertie said, leaving Brenna to wonder how the older woman could be so certain. "Nicole was in here not too long before making her way over there. The look on your face and not having Wes and Kenzie by your side tells me all I need to know." Brenna offered a half-hearted shrug while tracing a thumb around the rim of her coffee mug. She hadn't given Wes a chance to find her before leaving the booth. Whether or not he tried, she would never know. "Wes is pretty set on keeping his little girl safe," Gertie explained. "You and I both know that he won't settle for another heartbreak." Gertie was right, but there was still a sense of uncertainty that crossed Brenna's mind. She couldn't stand the thought of losing her best friend again. Not after she'd allowed him and Kenzie to take her heart. "If I know Wes, which I do," Gertie said with a sly smile and a wink. "He not only told Nicole something she didn't want to hear, but told her where to go as well." Brenna shared a light chuckle with Gertie and said, "But either way, I can't stand in the way of a mother. A family. I know what it's like being told I can't have kids. What if Nicole wants a second chance to make things right with Wes and Kenzie?" Gertie reached across the table and placed her hand on top of Brenna's. "Don't go getting all carried away and thinking that Wes will give her that second chance, Bren. Not everyone deserves it. You just need to take it one day at a time and wait for Wes to come and talk to you before you assume the worst." Brenna felt the sting of tears as they filled her eyes, but she held them back. She knew Gertie was right. She needed to take a step back and wait, no matter how difficult it would be. "You two have a date at the movie tonight, right?" Gertie asked, giving Brenna a knowing look and leaving Brenna no choice but to acknowledge the date they'd planned. "Well, okay then. That's when you should talk with Wes." Brenna nodded, knowing Gertie was right. She needed to talk to Wes, but it would not go the way Gertie had in mind. Instead, it would be Brenna telling him she would step back and give him and Kenzie enough room to decide without worrying about her. Brenna had looked forward to attending the movie on the green, but after getting back to her house, she thought about staying put for the evening. She had less than an hour to think it over while deciding whether to approach Wes about how she felt. She wanted him to know that she had no interest in standing in the way of Kenzie's relationship with her mother. Even if that meant her and Wes's relationship would end before it began. Brenna flipped on the TV and planned to watch a movie at home instead. It had been a while since she watched a movie on the Hallmark Channel, and tonight seemed like a good night for it. After watching the first 10 minutes of the movie, she tapped the power button on the remote and set it down on the stand next to the couch. She couldn't watch another minute of a sappy love story when her own love story was unraveling. She slipped on her flip-flops and closed the door behind her before heading down the street. Her house was just a few blocks east of the green, the perfect distance on foot. That was one thing she loved about the small town. Almost everything was within walking distance. Her heart raced at the thought of the conversation she would have with Wes. She couldn't help but wonder if she was making a terrible decision as she approached Main Street. The sun was setting, allowing the temperature to drop for a perfect night for a movie. She searched for any sign of Wes's truck, but it didn't take long to spot his old truck in front of Sizzle and Sip. Her stomach shifted into knots as she crossed the street and headed toward the central area of Main Street. She wanted to see Wes and Kenzie, but hesitation set in with worry when her eyes locked on Wes's from across the way. He offered a friendly smile and wave before heading her way. Her heart fluttered at the way he looked at her, as if he'd been waiting for her all this time. "Hey, I was hoping I'd see you," he said, looking over his shoulder toward the spot he'd left. Kenzie was sitting with her legs crossed in front of her on the blanket next to Ally. "It's a kids' movie tonight, so I think it's okay if we duck out of it for a bit." Brenna swallowed the lump in her throat as she struggled to find the words to say. She had so much she wanted to tell him, but she didn't know where to start. "I wanted to talk to you about earlier," Wes started, running a hand through his hair as he let out a sigh. "With Nicole?" "Wes, her words trailed off, deserting her and leaving her restless. She prayed for the courage to say what needed to be said. Once said, she could walk away and never look back. She didn't need to stick around and wait for her heart to break, she could feel it already. I don't think this is going to work out the way we thought it was going to." "What do you mean?" Wes's expression changed from relief at seeing her to something full of concern and uncertainty. "You have nothing to. I'm not the type who can stand in the way of a mother, Wes." I saw the way Kenzie ran up to her and wrapped her arms around her waist. "It kills me to think that Nicole left all of that behind. That she broke your heart, and Kenzie's too, but what if she wants another chance? I can't stand in the way of that. You guys are a family. She's Kenzie's mother. I can't." Brenna was rambling now, but she couldn't stop as the words poured from her heart. She feared losing something good, but she wanted what was best for Kenzie. "Bren, she's not going to get a second chance with me," Wes said matter-of-factly as he reached out and took hold of her arms and stared into her eyes. "I've been down that road more times than I care to admit. I've given her plenty of chances already. This isn't the first time she's begged for another chance just to turn around and walk away after a few weeks." Brenna's lip trembled as she fought to hold back her emotions. What will Kenzie think? She needs her mom. Wes glanced over his shoulder and back at Brenna. "I've already talked to her. I told her everything. Please, just stop and listen to me. You're not ruining anything by being with me, Bren. Kenzie's fine right where she is." Brenna shook her head as a tear rolled down her cheek. Wes wiped it away with his thumb as he took a step toward her. She stepped back, not wanting to give in to the need of having him close. "You can't make decisions that fast, Wes. Think about what it means to you and Kenzie. I can't stand in the way of that and know that, because of me," she choked back the emotion as she stumbled over her words. "Because of me, Kenzie won't get to see her mother." "That's not true, and you know it," Wes said, reaching out to her, but she pulled away. "I should go." She looked back in the direction she'd come from. She didn't have too far to walk, and she could make it before giving him a chance to talk her out of leaving. "Brenna, wait," he called after her. He'd followed her to the edge of the green, but Brenna knew he wouldn't venture too far away from Kenzie. As much as it hurt, she needed to give him a few days to think about Nicole and Kenzie. She needed to know that she'd given him a chance to work it out with Kenzie's mother without having to worry about distractions.
Chapter 17. Wes watched Brenna walk away. He wanted to chase after her and tell her that everything would be okay between them, but he couldn't leave his daughter. He could only pray that Brenna would eventually realize that Nicole wasn't getting another chance to mess things up for him and Kenzie. He wasn't allowing that to happen to him or his little girl again. Wes turned and headed back to the area in front of the movie screen and sat down next to his daughter. "Want some popcorn, Dad?" Kenzie asked, holding her bag of popcorn in front of him as he sat next to her. "It has M&Ms. "Well, in that case," Wes teased, reaching into the bag and scooping a handful of chocolate candy speckled popcorn into his mouth. Kenzie lost it in a fit of laughter, but quieted down once she realized the movie was about to start. "Thank you," Wes whispered over Kenzie's shoulder. She leaned into him and offered a partial hug before sitting upright once again. Kenzie stuffed a handful of popcorn into her mouth as she looked around next to her. "Dad, where's Miss Gibson?" Wes swallowed down the lump in his throat as he tried to come up with something. He hated lying to his daughter. He'd already told her about Nicole's visit and what it might mean for them in the future. Whether Nicole wanted to visit Kenzie in the future, he was more than okay with that. He wouldn't keep a mother away from her child. But what could he say about Brenna? After thinking about it for a minute, he went the simple route. "She couldn't make it, but she'll see you at school on Tuesday, okay?" Kenzie's brows furrowed as though she was trying to figure out why Brenna couldn't be there. Thankfully, she accepted his answer for what it was and nodded with a smile. "I can't wait to see her again." Wes was going to point out the fact that she just saw Brenna not even 4 hours ago, but decided against it. He had just enough time to say, "Me too," before the movie started playing on the screen. He could only pray that she would reconsider and want to see him again, too. Wes pulled his truck into a vacant spot in front of the Starlight Motel and shifted into park. The two of them normally spent Sunday afternoons after church with the Everses. They were like a second family to him, and he was incredibly grateful they had given him and Kenzie a place to live when they first moved back to town. "Do you think I can play with Dylan?" Kenzie asked as she unbuckled her seatbelt. Wes pulled the keys from the ignition and said, "I don't see why not. We'll be here for a little while." He climbed out of the truck and opened the door for his daughter. He would spend most of the day catching up with the Everses and seeing if there was anything they would like him to do around the motel. Anything to pass the time and keep his mind off of Brenna and away from reminders of the memories they shared, a task made difficult when living in a small town. "Hey, guys," Jane called out from the front entrance to the office with a wave. "It's good to see you again." Kenzie ran up and wrapped her arms around Jane's waist. "It feels like it's been forever." Wes and Jane shared a laugh as Wes said, "It's only been a few days, Kenz." "Is Dylan still here?" Kenzie asked as she looked up at Jane. Jane smiled and said, "Of course. He's inside, coloring at the desk. Andy had to run into town for a few things, so I'm watching him for her." Kenzie turned to look at Wes, and before she could ask, he gave her the okay and watched her run inside in search of her friend. "So I hear Reese is coming back soon?" Wes asked Jane as they made their way inside. "I want to see if there's anything else you guys need help with." "You've done plenty around here, Wes." "He'll be back later in September," Jane said. She stopped right inside the door and turned to face him. "We appreciate everything you've done so far, and I can't thank you enough, but—" "And I feel the same as you," Wes said with a smile. "You and Bill helped me out, so I'd like to think of it as returning the favor." Jane relaxed as she pulled Wes in for a hug. "You've always been like a son to us, and the good Lord knows we need all the help we can get around here." Wes shared a laugh as he followed Jane out back to where Bill was standing before they started discussing his plans with the motel. When he isn't busy with looking after the stables across town, Jane chimed in, giving her husband a subtle reminder that Wes had other things to tend to now. Bill seemed to ignore Jane's reminder as he looked at Wes. "I know Reese will be here in a few weeks, but what do you say we look around and figure out what all needs done before my hip surgery?" I'll go inside and see if there's something I can find for lunch, Jane said as she turned toward their house. Their house was near the motel, and Wes thought it had been smart of them to have it set up like that. If not, I'll take the kids into town and grab us something to eat at the diner and bring it back. They accepted her offer and Wes mentioned chipping in to cover the bill, to which Jane insisted there was no need to do that. But Wes handed over his card, anyway. Place an order at Sizzle and Sip to go. It's on me. Once Jane was inside, Wes followed Bill around the motel, pointing out the repairs he'd spent time on while knowing there were still quite a few things left to work on. He'd done what he could in the time that he and Kenzie had spent there, but the place was still in need of more TLC. Bill jotted down some notes in his notepad and flipped it closed. "I better head inside," Bill said, favoring his hip a bit more than usual. "This old hip of mine is giving me some trouble. I can't wait for the day I have surgery." Wes assisted Bill back to the entrance of the motel and offered him help inside. The last thing Bill needed was to fall and break the hip he would soon have replaced. Instead of going inside, Bill leaned against the railing of the front porch. "You'll be back to normal in no time," Wes assured him. "A brand new man." Bill chuckled lightly and said, "I don't know about that. This old body of mine has been through a lot. But you've got a lot to show for it," Wes said. "You and Jane have lived a great life here in this small town of ours. I'd find myself lucky to have half of what the two of you have." Wes reflected on his own words. He'd chosen a life outside of Silver Leaf Falls, but still found his way back home. He had a lot of regret for leaving everything behind, but it had given him a second chance to make things right and create a life here with his daughter. And Brenna. "Give it some time, son," Bill said as he hobbled over to a wicker chair and sat down. He was about to say something more when the sound of crunching gravel pulled their attention away from the conversation. Jane opened the back door of her car for Kenzie and Dylan before grabbing the large to-go bags from the front seat. "Time to eat," she said as she held up the bags and motioned for them to follow her inside. Wes rested a hand on Kenzie's shoulder as they walked into the motel and found a spot to sit behind the desk. There wasn't a lot of space for too many people, but Jane made enough room for them to sit while eating their lunch. "So when do you start at the stables, Wes?" Bill asked before taking a bite of his sandwich. "Tomorrow is my official start date," Wes answered. "But with Labor Day, I'll start Tuesday." Kenzie held up a chicken nugget and said, "My first day of school is then, too." "That's right," Bill said. He took a drink before asking, "Are you excited to have Miss Gibson as your teacher?" "I've heard nothing but great things about her." Wes took a bite of his food and tried his best to avoid the conversation while letting his daughter do all the talking. It benefited him as she led the table in full-on conversation about reading and what to expect during her first grade year. Dylan piped in about his aunt being an art teacher and something about throwing clay that Wes didn't quite understand until Jane explained, "Andy is a potter, but she barely finds the time to create." Wes finished his lunch and waited for Kenzie to finish hers before thanking them for a great afternoon. He looked at Bill and said, "Just let me know what you'd like to help with. You know where to find me." Bill slowly stood up from his chair and shook Wes's hand. "Thanks, son, I appreciate it." Jane offered Wes and Kenzie a quick hug on their way to the door as Dylan raced over to Kenzie and gave her a high five. "See you tomorrow at school." Wes and Kenzie waved one last time before heading to his truck and climbing in. It felt good to have people like the Everses in his life. It was that feeling that made starting over in Silver Leaf Falls worth it.
Chapter 18. Brenna greeted her class with a warm, friendly smile before writing her name across the whiteboard with a bright purple marker. "Welcome to the first day of first grade," Brenna announced as she turned to face her class once again. "I have lots of things planned for this big day, but first things first, I want us to tell everyone who we are and one thing that we love." Loud chatter and excitement filled the classroom as the students talked amongst each other. Brenna listened for a minute before interrupting by clapping her hands together. "Okay," she drawled as she gathered everyone's attention. "How about we each take turns? We'll start with..." She trailed off in an attempt to create excitement to share. It worked in a matter of seconds when the children squirmed in their seats and raised their hands high above their heads. "Me, pick me," a few said in unison around the room. It would take her a day or two to get everyone's names down, but thankfully she had spent Sunday afternoon placing name cards on each desk while assigning seats. "Okay, let's start with Tommy," Brenna said with a smile as she pointed to a young blonde-haired boy in the front row. "What is one thing you love the most?" Tommy still had his hand raised above his head as he thought for a minute. Brenna did her best to keep the rest of the children quiet as they waited for him to answer her question. "Dinosaurs." "Me too," a few others chimed in. "Dinosaurs are my favorite." "That's great, Tommy," Brenna said as she motioned for Madeline, who was sitting beside Tommy, to go next. She whispered her answer, telling the class that her name was Maddie and that she liked dogs. That seemed to get a few more children talking amongst themselves and agreeing that dogs were the best. Brenna couldn't help but laugh when Jade argued cats were better than dogs. For only being 6 years old, these kids had strong opinions and would voice them without backing down. Before it could lead into something a little more than a playful debate, Brenna snagged their attention back to the task at hand. "We still have quite a few to go, so why don't we ask Jessica what she loves?" "I really love my mom," the girl answered proudly. It didn't take long before another debate over mothers and fathers being the best ensued. Brenna chuckled at the determination of her first graders and allowed them to carry on a bit before corralling them back into focus. "Ally, how about you?" Brenna felt like she already knew Ally well enough, but still couldn't wait to hear what her answer would be. The young girl loved all things animals, coloring, and playing outside. Much like Kenzie, they were two peas in a pod. "I love my aunt, Katie," she said with a wide smile on her face. "She's really silly and sometimes strict, but I love her because she loves me." Brenna's heart melted at the thought of Katie being such a wonderful aunt. There was no doubt in Brenna's mind that Cooper was fitting into the role of uncle now that the two of them had married. "Miss Gibson, can I go next?" Kenzie piped up from Ally's side. Brenna nodded, giving her the okay to tell the class what she loved the most. She already knew Kenzie loved her father more than words could ever say, but a part of her couldn't wait to hear what the child would say. "I love my mom and dad," Kenzie started with a smile. Brenna's stomach nodded as Kenzie's words jabbed at her heart. "But I love horses, too." Agreeable nods and me too surrounded the room as Brenna shoved aside the heartache she felt from hearing Kenzie's love for her parents and mentioned her plans for the class to visit Silverleaf Stables in the spring. "How many of you like horses?" Several hands shot into the air as they responded in unison, "I do." "I do." Brenna clapped her hands together and said, "Well, that's good because I have something I'd like to tell you." She walked over to her desk and pulled a folded chart from the top folder. She opened it and hung it on the whiteboard for all to see. "This class is all about reading, so with Kenzie's help, I thought it would be fun to see how many books we can read this year. If we read 10 chapter books aloud as a class before February, we can take a trip to Silverleaf Stables and see the horses. How does that sound?" If she thought it excited her kids before the announcement, she had seen nothing yet. Kids were cheering and clapping as they talked about their favorite colors and shared stories of horses. Kenzie braved the commotion and said, "I live there so I can see them all the time." A few kids pouted and told her that wasn't fair, but Brenna intervened by saying, "There will be plenty of time to see the horses when we get there, but first, we have to do the work. That means we better get done with taking turns telling everyone what we love the most so we can start our first book." It didn't take long before the rest of her class finished their introductions and made new friends. There were some disagreements and hiccups along the way, but Brenna felt confident it was going to be a great year. A slight knock at the door pulled Brenna's attention from her class. As she made her way to the door, she prayed she wouldn't find Wes on the other side. She'd made it through the last 2 days without seeing him, keeping her word on backing away and giving him time to think about everything, so much so she had even ducked out of sight when he dropped Kenzie off that morning for school. Brenna felt foolish, but she couldn't let emotions impede a family being together. Brenna opened the door after taking a quick peek and smiled at Grandma Gertie, who carried in a tray of fresh-baked cookies for the kids. Hi, kiddos, Gertie announced as she set the tray on an empty table near the front of the classroom. My name is Grandma Gertie. I thought I'd bring you something sweet to eat before we read today. Gertie glanced back at Brenna, who was in awe of what the woman was capable of. The woman seemed to never stop and knew just what she needed on the first day of school. Brenna's heart melted just like the chocolate chip cookies did the minute she bit into one. These are so good, Brenna said, thankful to have someone like Gertie in her life. She made everything a little sweeter. I had a few hours last night before bed and thought it would be a good way to start the day, Gertie said cheerfully as she handed out cookies to each of Brenna's students. Would you like me to save a few for Wes? Brenna shot a look at Kenzie, who was chatting with Ally about horses and unicorns. Thankfully, Gertie's voice hadn't carried over the loud commotion surrounding them. Brenna turned back to her and shook her head. No, but thanks anyway. Gertie gave her a knowing grin and said, okay, but you know what they say, the way to a man's heart is through. I know, but I don't think I'll see him today, Brenna said. She wanted to see him. She truly did. It had been her decision to walk away and give him space, and she shouldn't feel as miserable about it as she felt. But maybe Kenzie will give him one if you ask her to? Brenna tried to play it off, but Gertie caught on. What happened between you two? I thought you were going to talk to him and everything would be back to normal for you two lovebirds. Brenna didn't want to explain what happened to Gertie. Especially not here or right now. She wanted to forget everything, if only for a minute, while she surrounded herself with the one thing she loved the most, teaching.
Chapter 19. Wes spent most of the day out in the stables, working alongside other ranch hands while learning the ropes. Training with the guys hadn't given him much downtime, but he would not complain. He'd lost sleep the night before while tossing and turning as thoughts of Brenna and Kenzie's mother kept him awake. He wanted what was best for Kenzie, but he wanted them both to be happy. Happiness was something Nicole couldn't give them. Even if she had at one time, it had been short-lived and thrown out the window the minute she walked away. Besides, leaving Silver Leaf Falls was not an option now that he had a job working at the stables and his daughter was in school. He would be foolish to run back to the city and believe Nicole wanted another chance. Brenna deserved better than that. He'd be even more foolish to allow Brenna to walk away and do nothing about it. What's got you so quiet? Dax asked, slapping a gloved hand against the wooden slat next to Wes. Wes hadn't realized Dax had entered the stable while he was lost in thought about what he would say to Brenna when it came time to pick Kenzie up from school. He could only hope she wouldn't duck out of sight like she had that morning. Just thinking about Kenzie's first day, Wes lied as he mucked hay into a rust-covered wheelbarrow beside him. I hope she's having fun and making new friends. Dax tipped his cowboy hat and grinned. There's no doubt in my mind that Kenzie's enjoying her time in school. You and I both know how much Brenna loves kids. She wants the best for her students much like she would for her own children. Wes drove the shovel into the pile of used hay as he thought about what Brenna shared with him years ago. The thought of her not being able to have kids of her own one day upset him because he knew deep down that she would make a wonderful mother. I mean, look at how much Kenzie talks about her, Dax continued, opening the stall next to Wes and stepping inside to ready the horse for training. You'd think Brenna was her mother if you didn't know any better, am I right? Wes thought about Dax's words and nodded. He could see where Dax would think that. And not only Dax, but the rest of the town as well. Everyone knew Brenna loved kids. She loved teaching and gave it her all while making sure the kids were learning well. I'm going to take Jack out for a bit, but if I'm not back before you take off, I'll see you in the morning, Dax said as he guided the paint horse out of the stall toward the exit. And Wes, he called out over his shoulder as he stopped short of leaving the stable. Wes straightened and turned toward Dax. You've got a good thing going with Brenna. Don't walk away from her this time, all right? Wes nodded as he continued mucking out the stall. If he had his way about it, no one would walk away from anyone again. Wes finished the last 2 stalls for the day and cleaned up before heading into town. He had originally planned to take Kenzie out for ice cream, but now that he thought things over, he would ask Brenna to come along with them. Wes hoped she'd say yes. He knew she wouldn't be able to say no if Kenzie got on board with having her join them. He grinned at the thought of plotting his daughter's admiration against her teacher. Wes waited a few minutes before pulling into a vacant spot near the entrance. He'd thought about what he would say to Brenna on the drive into town, and he knew it was his chance to make her realize how much she meant to him. He killed the engine and tucked the keys into the front pocket of his jeans as he made his way inside. It didn't take long before he arrived at the classroom that housed his two favorite girls. He heard Brenna telling the kids what to expect tomorrow while promising them another fun-filled day. Wes stopped short of the classroom door and leaned against the wall as he waited for a line of kids to walk out of the classroom in a single-file line. He heard Kenzie talking about horses with Brenna as he pushed himself away from the wall and stepped through the doorway leading into the classroom. Excitement radiated from his daughter's face as she caught him sneaking in. "Dad!" She raced over to him, and once she was close enough, he reached out and lifted her into his arms. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed his cheek before telling him all about her first day at school. He glanced over at Brenna, who busied herself with packing her bag while preparing to head home for the night. Grandma Gertie placed the book they must have been reading before dismissing for the day on the bookshelf and made her way over to them. She stood beside them and asked Kenzie, "Would you like to take a walk with me? We can venture outside and swing for a few minutes. How does that sound?" Kenzie looked from Gertie to Wes and, with a nod of approval, Wes lowered her to the floor and watched as she took hold of the woman's hand. She looked back over her shoulder and made sure he knew she would be back soon. "Have fun," Wes called after her as he watched the two of them mosey down the hallway. He turned his attention back to Brenna, who was now pulling the drawstrings on her bag and preparing to leave. "Can we talk?" he asked, praying she would say yes. Everything he thought he'd planned to say was at the tip of his tongue, but seconds from going right out the window. "Okay," she said, setting her bag down on the desk. She looked at him with uncertainty as he made his way over to her. "I don't think it's fair that you didn't give me a chance to tell you how much you mean to me the other night," he said, taking another step closer. "Nicole can come back to town all she wants, but that won't change what I want." Brenna looked down at the strings hanging from the top of her bag and fiddled with them before looking back up at him. "And what do you want?" Wes inhaled a deep breath and released it slowly. A failed attempt to calm his racing heart. He'd been prepared to say whatever he needed to say to make Brenna understand she was the only one he wanted in his life, but now, looking her in the eye, he was at a loss for words. The familiar scent of her perfume took him back to a time when things weren't so difficult. When they could be young and not worry about what tomorrow would bring. "I want you, Brenna," he said in a breathless whisper. His nerves were getting the best of him. This was a moment he needed strength and confidence the most. "Sometimes I look back at the decisions I've made and realize there are quite a few things I regret. But one thing I'll never regret is falling in love with you and starting over here in Silver Leaf Falls." Brenna's eyes filled with tears as she studied him. He felt a slight resistance and he reached out for her and thanked God that she allowed him to pull her in close to him. "I want you today, tomorrow, and for the rest of mine and Kenzie's lives, Bren," Wes said. He wrapped his arm around her and held her there in front of him as he witnessed storm clouds of uncertainty gathering in her eyes. "You're the best thing aside from Kenzie that's ever happened in my life, back then and now. I never want you to think I don't love you, because honestly, I've loved you since the first day I met you." Brenna raised a brow, questioning everything he was saying. "I'm being serious." He ran a hand through his hair, praying that she would believe him. "I love you, Bren. I want to spend the rest of my life right here in Silver Leaf Falls with you and Kenzie. I mean it." A tear slipped down her cheek, and Wes swiped it away with his thumb before leaning his head against hers. He placed a kiss on her forehead and prayed that she would tell him how much she loved him. How much she wanted to be a part of his little family. "What do you say? Will you be a part of mine and Kenzie's lives forever?" She looked up now, looking him straight in the eye, which caused him to hold on to whatever hope he had left that she'd say yes. "Yes," she answered with a shy smile. "I love you and Kenzie more than anything else in this world. Even more than teaching," he teased. "Close," she said, giving him a playful smile. You both are at the top of the list of things I love the most. Wes released the breath he'd been holding and leaned into Brenna. No sooner had their lips met in a kiss he wanted to continue forever, and his little girl squealed right alongside Grandma Gertie. Yay! Dad loves Miss Gibson, Kenzie announced as she bounced on her toes and clapped her hands with glee. Grandma Gertie offered them a playful wink and said, "Love always wins, doesn't it?"
Epilogue. The mid-September afternoon was perfect for a trail ride down by the river. The leaves were changing from vibrant forest green to sunburnt orange, with red tips. Brenna climbed into the saddle behind Wes, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Riding lessons have been good for her," she whispered as they watched Kenzie climb into the saddle of a chestnut pony. Brenna was more than proud of how far Kenzie had come in such a short amount of time. Practice makes perfect. It won't be long before she wants to take part in barrel races. Wes offered a subtle laugh and said, "I'm not sure about all of that." Brenna exchanged a smile with Kenzie and asked, "Are you ready?" Kenzie gave a nod as she nudged her pony to follow alongside Wes and Brenna. Brenna was beyond impressed with Kenzie's ability to control the pony, and even more impressed that she stuck with riding lessons when it became challenging. They rode side by side along the trail, taking in the beauty of Vermont and enjoying the much-needed break from their day-to-day routines. It felt good to spend time together on the weekends, like they were a family. "What do you say we stop at our favorite spot under the old oak tree?" Wes asked, guiding Zip toward the well-known spot. "How does that sound to my two favorite girls?" Kenzie nudged the pony before guiding her alongside Zip. Brenna smiled down at Kenzie as they rode side by side, matching step for step. The mid-afternoon clouds rolled in, casting a blanket of protection from the fiery sun. After coming to stop, Brenna climbed off the back of the horse and planted her feet on the ground. Wes climbed down out of the saddle and tied off the Appaloosa before helping Kenzie off the pony. "You're getting pretty good at riding by yourself, Kenz," Brenna stated as she patted Kenzie on the back. Kenzie removed the helmet she'd been wearing and laid it next to an old stump on the ground. "It won't be long before you're riding without us by your side." Kenzie looked up at her and shook her head. "But what if I always want you and Dad to be with me?" Brenna shot a look at Wes as her heart melted. If Kenzie wasn't the epitome of a sweetheart, Brenna didn't know who was. Brenna looked back at Kenzie and said, "I'm okay with that." Wes wrapped an arm around Brenna's waist and walked beside her toward the river. The spot they'd snuck off to when they skipped school had become one of their favorite spots to relax at as they got older. "Look, Dad," Kenzie called out as she skipped a rock across the river. "Remember when you first taught me how to do this and I couldn't do it?" Brenna exchanged an impressed glance with Wes as he stood beside her. "Now look at you go," Wes cheered and clapped his hands. "My little girl's growing up." Brenna was thankful for the time she could spend with Wes and Kenzie. She had her doubts and fears about Wes and Kenzie staying in Silverleaf Falls, but it was obvious now that they were there to stay. "Look over here," Wes said, pointing out the carved initials in the tree. "How long do you think these will be here?" Brenna shrugged. She wasn't knowledgeable about trees. They were far from her area of expertise. But she played along and took a shot with her best guess. "Maybe forever?" Wes smiled at her response without taking his eyes from the tree. "If that's the case, we should put our initials here, too." Fascinated with the idea, Brenna focused on the tree and paid little attention to what was going on around her. What she thought had been Kenzie showing Wes a neat rock she found along the river bank ended up being something much more than that. Brenna brought her hand to her mouth and held back the emotion threatening to escape. "Wes," she whispered, "Kenzie." "What? What's this?" She stammered over her words as she looked from the ring in Wes's hand to Kenzie and Wes. Wes knelt to the ground and positioned himself on one knee in front of her while Kenzie leaned against him with a smile plastered on her face. "Miss Gibson," Kenzie said, looking at her father before continuing, "will you marry my dad?" Complete surprise took hold of Brenna. Never in a million years would she expect Wes Davis to propose to her, let alone after going through a rough divorce. But Wes was her best friend, and best friends they would always be. Yes, Brenna said. Yes, I will marry him and love the both of you forever. Yay! She said yes, Dad. Kenzie shouted, bouncing up and down as she clapped next to them. Just like me, and Grandma Gertie knew she would. Brenna's mouth dropped as she exchanged a questioning look with Wes. Wes held up his hands in defense and said, "Don't look at me. You know Grandma Gertie." Kenzie wrapped her arms around both of their legs and gave them a gentle squeeze. "I love you both to the moon and back." "And we love you, too, Kenz," Brenna said, bending down and lifting the young girl into her arms. "Forever and for always." Brenna couldn't help but laugh as Wes swooped her into his arms, lifting her off the ground as she held on tight to Kenzie. He twirled her around and set her back down before stealing a kiss from her. "I love you, Bren. Always. I love you, too." This has been Starting Over in Silverleaf Falls by Christina Butrum. Audio, copyright 2022.